Hi, everyone. My name is Matthew Vaughn. I'm with the Lake Champlain Basin Program. And thanks to Chris and Dana for putting this together. Amazing to have this done on such short notice. And I think we'll all be forgiving of each other for throwing together presentations. So thank you in advance. So I wanted to talk about some of the work we've been doing using the Lake Champlain long-term monitoring program data to look at chloride specifically. And the presentation really focuses on a manuscript that is, about 92% done. You can probably all relate how hard it is to finish these things, but 3/4 of the co-author team is in the room. We have May-Kate Campbell with the Basin program there, Will Souters right sitting next to May-Kate at UVM, finishing up his master's degree. Brendan Wiltsey at Adirondack Watershed Institute couldn't make it today, and me on this paper. So the idea with this work is to really, am I like on the screen here? That's what's going on. That was a spotlight, but it's just a projector. Okay. So the idea is to really characterize chloride, conditions for chloride as they are today, as they were in the early 90s when this program began, and to look at the big picture of what's happening with de-icing salt pollution in the Lake Champlain Basin. And it's really kind of a precursor to other work we have queued up with our partners as well. And also I'll mention that I've reported on a lot of this work in a report you may have seen in 2019, where I kind of looked at everything we have for tributary, Lake Champlain tributary monitoring, but it was kind of hidden in a big report, almost 100 pages of just data and tables. And this is an opportunity we saw to really highlight the chloride story and de-icing pollution in the Lake Champlain Basin. So really quickly on methods, really quickly. Starting in 1991, we're looking at 18 tributaries where we have enough data. There's 22 total we monitor, but not all of them go back to early 90s. So that's over 8,000 samples for tributaries, 15 sites in the lake. So we're looking at both watershed and in the lake for this paper. Over 7,000 samples in the epilimnion or unstratified. We looked at how well mixed it is, and we thought it was good enough to just go with epilimnion or unstratified samples for in-lake. And you'll see a map there of the long-term monitoring program stations that's funded by the Lake Champlain Basin Program in partnership with SUNY Plattsburgh and Vermont DEC. Okay, so methods, we're combining concentration data from grab samples with stream flow data from USGS gauges on the major tributaries. I used a model called WRTDS, Weighted Regression on Time, Discharge, and Season. It's developed by the US Geological Survey. It's really the best tool we have to look at long-term trends and ways to predict concentrations. And it has a daily time step, so you can see concentrations for every day going back to 1991 I use it for phosphorus, chloride, nitrogen, all our main constituents we monitor. So once we have those concentrations at a daily time step, I'm able to estimate loading, generally by multiplying by the stream flow from those gauges. And the cool thing about this model is it has really neat tools, statistical tools, to separate the influence of changing stream flow and changing watershed management. And it can also statistically reduce the influence of interannual flow variability. So obviously when we have a high flow year, we're going to have more phosphorus, more chloride coming downstream. But with this tool, we can statistically reduce that influence and look at what are our trends over time if there were not that flow variability over time. So that's mostly what I'll be talking about, is that type of result. Okay, here's a lot of plots. This is the annual mean chloride concentrations for 18 tributaries to Lake Champlain. It's a lot of plots, but just kind of blur your eyes and look, are they going up or are they going down? So the results are showing us that 15 out of 18 of our major tributaries are significantly increasing in chloride concentration since the early 1990s. The magnitude of that change varies. And I should have said these vertical axes, they're probably hard for you to read. They differ from plot to plot. I'm kind of highlighting the trends here, not the actual numbers, but if you have your glasses on, you could read the numbers. The magnitude varies from 3 milligrams per liter change over this time period to 19.1 milligrams per liter over this time period. That is an enormous change. So that's about, the minimum is like 41% increase. The maximum is about 163% increase in annual mean chloride concentration. So this alone is a huge finding, a huge environmental shift in our watershed. Only the La Platte River showed a significant decrease over this time period, a decrease in 20 milligrams per liter or 39% decrease. So that is an outlier for our tributaries. La Platte River that goes to Shelburne Bay. I'm not going to talk about a lot of whys, just a lot of what's in this talk, but we can, if there's questions, we can discuss. This, I think it was May Kate who named these the Colgate plots, right? Colgate toothpaste. I don't know. So these are probability of exceedance. And so what you're seeing, so these actually the vertical scales are consistent here. And you'll see horizontal dotted lines on some benchmarks we made. So 20 milligrams per liter is about the maximum you'd see in a natural freshwater stream or river. 35 milligrams per liter is a benchmark for where we start to see documented environmental degradation of some kind. And what you're seeing, 2 time periods. The pink is the first half of record, and the blue is the second half of record. So it's helpful to, I like to read these kind of horizontally. So if you look at, I don't know how to point, just look at Winooski River. Oh gosh, here we go. Winooski River, bottom right here. In the first half of record, there was about a 50% chance of exceeding 20 milligrams per liter on any given day. And for the first half of record. For the second half of record, the probability is more like 75% of exceeding that benchmark. Looking at the Little Otter, similarly, exceeding that benchmark of 20 milligrams per liter, about a 25% chance the first half of record. Now it's about 50-50. So this is just another way to show the previous group of plots where, and this is more focusing on the day-to-day impact it might have on biota in the stream. Now we're looking at load, so mass of chloride moving downstream per time. Similar story, 15 out of 18 of our major tributaries significantly increasing over this time period. The magnitude of increase ranging from 71 metric tons per year more than in 1991 to, get ready for this, 26,800 metric tons per year greater than it was in the early 1990s. So that's a roughly 2% increase on the bottom end to a 127% increase. So the way the kind of talking point I use when I've given interviews or when we're talking about our State of the Lake report, the Winooski River in the early 1990s delivered about 20,000 metric tons of chloride per year. That's about 44 million pounds of chloride, as in the ion chloride, not road salt. Now it delivers twice that annually. So roughly 80 to 90 million pounds per year. Okay, some other things we are looking at in this paper. How does chloride loading relate to impervious land cover? Here are some maps. The first one is the same numbers I showed you, but divided by watershed area. So we call that yield. Yield is the mass per year, but divided by watershed area. So you can kind of talk about different watersheds fairly. So it's kind of colored. Purples are low, yellows are high. You can see, for example, the Winooski River has the highest chloride loading per watershed area, so the highest yield. The middle panel there is the percent impervious cover. This is from the ocean land cover mapping that the Lake Champlain Basin Program supported in 2015 and 2016. Sorry, well, the imagery is from 2015-16. It was done a few years later. The third panel is the ratio of the two. So the yield divided by the impervious cover. So you're seeing here is the signature of land or watershed management. The map probably speaks for itself, but we're seeing the highest colors, the highest values of this ratio on the New York side, where we know that chloride or road salt use is very high. I'm gonna keep cruising. Probably out of time already. Okay. All right, so the next question, this is a tool I've used for phosphorus a lot and spoken a lot about for phosphorus, but I haven't spent as much time on it with chloride. So this is another tool associated with that model that I'm using that USGS developed. What portion of trends are driven by changes in stream flow versus watershed management? So climate change, we have more storms, lower base flow, all these effects happening. How much of the changes can be attributed to changes in stream flow versus changes in, say, de-icing salt application? So this is a new type of graph I'm showing. I'm going to explain the plot before I put up data. So the vertical axis would be percent change due to changes in stream flow, and the horizontal axis is a percent change due to changes in watershed management. It statistically teases these two apart and plots it on a two-dimensional space. So if it hangs out on the horizontal axis, it's more changes are more due to watershed management. Did that in the right order. And if it's more in the vertical axis, it's more due to changes in stream flow. And so this is the trends in chloride concentration. They're colored by significant difference. So if it's red, it's a significant increase over this 30-year time period. And they're all hanging out on the horizontal axis, meaning, not surprisingly, these changes are due to changes in watershed management. They cannot be, primarily explained by changes in stream flow over time. Not a surprise for chloride, but important to show. I will say, I don't have time to talk about it. Never mind. Okay. So this is the same plot for chloride loading. So what's interesting here is the changes in stream flow. The points are landing close to the horizontal axis, but also above it or in the positive region vertically. So that's showing that, yes, the increases are driven by watershed management changes, but also exacerbated by changes in stream flow. So that's, if they're hanging out in that upper right region, it means that the effects are additive. They're both pushing the loading to increase over this 30-year time period. If those effects were equal, they'd be on this one-to-one line. They're kind of between the horizontal and this one-to-one, meaning that it's primarily watershed management, but partially being increased by changes in stream flow. Okay, now we're going to go downstream to the lake. That was all tributary. Now we're in the lake. This is actually in our State of the Lake report for 2021. We'll be updating this graphic for our next report, just showing chloride concentrations at our relatively deep lake sites and our relatively shallow lake sites since the early 1990s, and highlighting when these trends reversed. So we have generally an increase in the first decade of monitoring, generally a decrease for the second decade, and a sharp increase in more recent years. Broken out by lake region, Main Lake, Mallett's Bay, Missisquoi Bay, Northeast Arm, South Lake. We see differences among these regions, but a similar story. I have vertical dotted lines showing significant break points in these trends. And I added some statistics so you can see essentially the slope of these lines, on the order of 1% increase per year in the Main Lake, and about 0.5% for some of the other regions of the lake. And total percentage increase, 54% increase in the Main Lake, 30% increase over this time period for Mallett's Bay, et cetera. This is we also in the paper try to put the two stories together. Obviously, there's a link here. This is the annual mean tributary concentrations and the annual mean lake concentrations for the regions of the lake that the tributaries drain to. And you can see how the trends line up. We also have plots and statistics on correlations between the two, but this is kind of just a visually easy thing to check out for this presentation. Do I have time? 1 minute. Oh boy. Okay. Oh, that sounds nice. No, I'll be quick. Okay. Water. So I wanted to mention we have relatively new water quality monitoring buoys at a few locations throughout the lake. I gotta be quick here. And then in the Lamoille River, monitoring connectivity, specific connectivity. Data.lcbp.org has all that data in real time when the buoys are deployed. Wanted to mention some other research that the Basin Program is supporting. I mentioned that we were trying to wrap up this journal article. The Ausable River Association and Adirondack Watershed Institute did an amazing study at Mirror Lake in the Adirondacks, doing a mass balance for chloride and relating it to stormwater mapping, all sorts of great stuff. The Basin Program is supporting more monitoring for Mirror Lake. We're also supporting a basin-wide study of chloride data. I showed you the big picture for the lake and the major tribs. They're going to be looking at regional chloride data and inland lakes further. They're also doing a study forecasting road salt usage into the future by downscaling climate models. Really cool, important work looking at that, going above and below that freezing point and trying to predict how much de-icing salts may be necessary in the future to maintain road service. And Middlebury College study, I'll let them talk about that one later today. So I mentioned State of Alert report for the first time in 2021 told this basic chloride study. We're doing it again in 2024 to be determined how much we'll be able to get into it, if we'll just be updating the graphic or be able to tell more of the story now that we have this paper put together. But we're not going to drop it from the report. And questions. That was a photo of me standing on the lake with my son in 2019. He hasn't seen it frozen since, unfortunately, but kind of a climate changey photo for this talk. All right, thank you. Out. Okay.
2 minutes till
Okay.
1 o'clock. I'm gonna try to fiddle with this
Okay.
while you answer a couple questions.
Okay.
How about that?
Great. It's a whirlwind. Sure. Hey, Dan. Yeah, so outlier, I think point source improvements, wastewater treatment may be the main driver for decreases there. It was discussed a bit in Eric Smeltzer's paper in 2012, although we don't have great data to show exactly why, but that's, I think, point source. Yes. I guess so. Yes. Sure. Yeah. Sorry, the what? Not in this paper. That actually was included in when Eric and Angela did their work in 2012. It was included, but it's a little more difficult to use for the tributary modeling. But it's something I'm interested in doing in the future. So good question. I'd like to. Sure, Kriya.
Yeah, back to the Lopata Marsh, has that data been collected since those 40,000 square foot, salt stations were?
Yeah.
Some of the recent monitoring data shows there's, I guess I don't know where the USGS gauge would be for monitoring.
Yeah. It's upstream, right? Yeah. So that was. Thank you for confirming.
Because there's some big changes since the salt.
Yes, I know that's been a concern. One of the limitations we have is our monitoring. We have the stream flow monitoring wherever they put the stream flow gauge, and then we have water quality monitoring wherever it's safe for our crews to be out there. So it's often a road crossing, not necessarily co-located. So there are some limitations there, and I know there's been a lot of concern with the La Platte River watershed salt storage, and I don't think we're capturing any changes that could be happening with this monitoring, but I think there's been other monitoring associated with that. It just wouldn't be captured here. Sorry. Oh, perfect. That's right, of course.
I just, want to make sure that paper comes out, that it's your report.
Well, there is a bit of nuance with the La Platte because we started so high with the La Platte in the early 1990s. Most of the gains were first decade and a half. And now it's actually leveled off and increasing similar to all the other ones. So that's why it really seems like the point source improvement drove those early reductions. I was talking about 30-year trends. So a 30-year trend, the line is still decreasing. But if you look at the actual more nuanced trend, it's reflective of other parts of the region where we had those gains and now we're creeping back up. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. For concentration. Yeah. Meaning it started, had the highest concentrations we've seen in this time period. It just started so high compared to others. Yeah. Yeah, it's a trade-off because if you have consistent, of course it's hard to see it in a short talk, but Oh, I'm taking advantage of this.
We're fine.
Okay.
This is great.
The
We
clicking
don't
going
really-
on next to me.
This is like
Um,
watching monkeys do
Yeah,
things.
but we are good if you have a good answer completed.
Yes, he does.
Then
Okay, I'll leave it there then. I'll take your word for it. Should I stop? Okay.
yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew Vaughn. Are you good?
Well, actually, we need to pull up a story map.
Oh, okay. So I'll let Dana get ready here while I,
don't
no, I'll
actually
introduce you
work.
while you're
Terrible.
working. You can listen to me. So the next presentation is Becky Tharp and Dana Allen. They're talking about de-icing storage as a salt point source, and they have, I think, more than one project that they're working on, or kind of talking about something that's been done and something that's coming in the future. Does that sound right? They're always doing something. That's right. So I will turn it to the two of you, and just so we know, we do have a small buffer that I planned in there secretly. So I will account for that.
Stop watching me type my password. Well, I gave it to them. Okay. Holy cow. All right, let's see. Okay. Chris, thanks. Is this my phone? Look at that. Thanks, Chris. Also, just to clarify, like Chris organized a symposium, and I was just like, we should do it. And then she actually organized it. Probably no one can hear me. Make sure Zoom people can hear me. So really thanks go to her, and also any of the mess ups are definitely Chris too. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about we're kind of going from a macro scale. This is very distracting. We're going from a really macro scale to a micro scale with this study, and so we're going to be talking about de-icing storage as a salt point source. This is research that Becky and I have been engaged in over a long time now, and so. Just to give you a bit of site context here, we have this handy dandy story map on the online machine right here, which is what we were trying to mess with right now. So we're basically looking at the La Platte River. So you can see that watershed there outlined in orange. So it's a smaller watershed to Shelburne Bay, but the site that we're looking at in specific really is adjacent to this Class 1 wetland. I have all these cool zoom controls that are buried in this view. So anyway, this is a Class 1 wetland. Class 1 wetlands are relatively rare in Vermont. This is one of, I think, 8, right at the mouth of the La Platte River. And in specific, we're monitoring the runoff from these 2 salt sheds. There's a rail spur. So there's a rail line that comes through here to the east. And then there's a spur that comes off. Basically, we get de-icing material off trains that go into these 2 covered facilities. They do have stormwater BMPs. So there's a wet detention pond right here. So it's just a pond, big dumb pond. And there's an outlet to this pond. That is one of our monitoring sites. They also have another stormwater BMP to sort of the south of the site. It's just a swale and a level spreader in this area. This whole facility sits on a sandy terrace above clay soils that are adjacent to La Platte. So they're kind of topographically higher than the river. And so this swale basically takes a bunch of water and kind of spills it out into the adjacent forested area. We have another monitoring point, which we'll talk about a lot, this seep. And essentially what we're seeing there is we see a lot of water coming down through the sandy terrace, then it hits this clay layer. We see water seeping out at the toe of the slope. And so we were able to actually install a monitoring well at that location. So we're able to get an idea of what's going on with that water through that monitoring well there. About my instructions are over there. I'm all lost now. Okay, we'll zoom out a little bit. Oh, the other thing I wanted to point out with this site is that there are actually monitoring points, sentinel monitoring points that DEC has installed. And actually that may be playing into your data, and I'm curious, we should talk about that later. But their monitoring point is down here, downriver. Yeah.
But that's the one from that's an STF one, and then the one from DEC is up by the bridge, the Route 7.
Well, and there's the downstream one too.
But that's
Yeah.
that's the one from the salt storage facility on
Oh, right. Yeah, they're sent. So the DEC one is up here by the bridge, and then there's another Sentinel monitoring site down here. And so that's basically the monitoring point where they determine whether there are any exceedances of the chloride standard at this point. And as we remember from this handy dandy graphic showing the watershed, which is not showing up any longer because the internet is a hard place to live. It's a relatively large watershed. And there's a lot of water coming down through here. And so this Sentinel monitoring point that is downstream of this facility gets a lot of noise, and it can be really difficult to determine a signal from a facility such as this. And so our research was basically looking at what kind of signal are we seeing from monitoring points that are more closely associated with surface water leaving the site and groundwater leaving the site. Did I do it? We practiced this never. So yeah, we did that. Oh, right. We wanted to get credit for this too. Because we feel really neat. We put all our data on this dashboard here. We're going to be talking about this data, but we reported all of this data using this handy dandy online dashboard, which allows us to see at least it's 3 years of data on this slider. And then we have some interactive points here where we can additionally see some characteristics associated with these monitoring points. So am I turning it over to you now? Okay. Yeah, it's yours. And I'll just tell you things.
Thanks, folks. So we're going to talk to you about this study, which is really kind of in two parts. The first part was associated with a 2018-2019 continuous monitoring of that pond outlet location that Dana talked about and the seep. And then we also have a control site, which is monitoring a location that's similar to the pond outlet in size, but it doesn't include a salt storage facility. The goals of that study were to identify the points of discharge and a reference and compare them to see if there was a difference between this reference and the points from the salt storage facility, monitor chloride continuously, monitoring conductivity continuously in the water, measuring chloride monthly, doing a cross check to the conductivity measurements. And then we did a soils sampling and some tree sampling, some vegetation, hemlock at the discharge points and at the reference to see if there was a difference between the soils and the vegetation. All of that, including detailed methods, you can find in this on the bottom bullet. That's the reference for the paper. It's also in that list that Chris handed out because we just don't have time to talk about the details of how we did it all, but that's where you can find it all. And the other thing we're going to talk about is basically the same monitoring continued. So same continuous monitoring from 2020 to 2023, which is not in the paper. It's a continuation post-paper publication. And then also more investigation on the soils, because as you'll see, we found some interesting findings with the preliminary data from the soils. So I'm just going to jump right into the results because we're not going to talk about methods. Like Matt said, there just isn't enough time. So to start, I'll just show you the data from the grab samples from 2018 versus the 2020, 2023. So these sites are on the right of both graphs. That's the control site. In the middle is the seep location. And then on the left, the pond outlet. And they're just differed by, one of them's grouped by 2018, 2019, one's grouped 2020 through 2023. So similar to actually some of the ways that Matt was talking about, like the early phase, late phase in his data. So you can see there's a seep site is quite high, especially in the 2018, 2019. And those little dashed lines, which maybe you can make out, there's a yellow one down low and a red one up high. The red one is the acute standard for chloride exceedances, the 860 milligrams per liter. And then that yellow line is the chronic standard. So the seep outlet exceeded the acute standard on several occasions in 2018, 2019. And in the pond outlet and the seep exceeded the chronic standard continuously almost throughout that whole period. Now, when we separate out after 2019 in the 2020, 2023, seep and pond outlet still statistically differ from the control site. So they're higher, they have more chloride in them, but the seep site is lower than it was in 2018, 2019. And to give you, do you want to
say In case you didn't notice the scale there, the chronic standard is 230 milligrams per liter chloride, whereas the acute standard is 860 milligrams per liter chloride. So, I mean, when we were looking at Matt's data, some of the highest values were like 60 and 70 milligrams per liter. So we're talking, I mean, these are EPA standards for impairment. They're quite high. So just to keep that in mind, like the scale at which we're playing.
Yeah, thanks, Dana. And so just to give some context, this is the site map, and the seep location is right here, and it's right next to the unloading area. And what happened between, I think it was around 2019, they installed a cover over the unloading area, and we hypothesized that the reason why we're seeing a reduction in that seep site was because of modifications they made to the site to address some of the spillage that they were having during the unloading period. And I'm just going to like really move through because I know this, we don't have much time. This is some data that the site itself monitors at wells around the property. And this is their data from 2016 to 2021. And you can see that one site there all the way over on the right, where you get some really high numbers in their groundwater monitoring. And that is adjacent here. See, that's what I showed you before. That's the same site adjacent to where we had been monitoring. So they were getting the same values in their groundwater monitoring, which is why they installed that the cover. This is our continuous chloride concentrations from 2018 to 2019. The orange is the seep, pond outlet is blue, and the control is black. This is the same thing from 2020 to 2023. Things I just want to point out, these are them side by side, is you can see that we were up above the acute standard for that early part of the monitoring period in 2018. And then since then it's been below the acute standard, but it's still always above the chronic standard. These are still high numbers. These are still 600 is like the average for that site. Just jumping into the soil samples really quickly. So the first year when we did the monitoring in 2018, 2019, we took some soil samples at the pond outlet, the seep, and the control, and found that, not surprisingly, chloride's high at the seep, which is exactly where we're seeing chloride high in the water. But interestingly, sodium is higher at the pond outlet. And we thought this was interesting because it represents basically a different way to measure loading than you can get with the concentration, is particularly when you're monitoring places that don't have concurrent flow monitoring. Getting at that loading question is a lot more complicated. And so the soils kind of represent this opportunity to look at differences in flow. And the pond outlet has much more flow that comes from it because all of the impervious cover on the site is directed to the pond and then discharges to the wetland from the pond. So even though the concentrations of chloride coming from that site are lower, the overall loading to the wetland is much higher. As a result of that monitoring, we thought it might be interesting that maybe what's happening, if we're getting all this loading of sodium, that there could be this cation exchange happening inside the soils. So you're displacing native soil cations like the magnesium, potassium, calcium, in favor of the sodium. So in order to look more closely at that, we did more soil sampling at multiple layers in the soils. And this is all from the pond outlet. That white dotted line is basically pointing from the outlet of the pond and then through the wetland. And what we thought we were going to see, the one on the left is the sodium, is that you'd see sort of like a pluming and then it would reduce as it goes out. And then maybe with some of the cations that you'd see the opposite. So you'd see lower levels close to the pond outlet and then higher levels as you move away. It's not exactly as clean as one would like. It's a little bit all over the place. It's complicated because we're also in the wetland, we're getting backwatering effects, and neither one of us are soil scientists. So we really ran up against the limits of our knowledge of soil. So if anyone is a specialist in soils, we'd be really interested just to see if there's more ways we could dig into these data in particular. Yeah, that one was more, we bit off more than we could chew on that. And then lastly, this is the results of the vegetation sampling with the hemlock. And it's just really pretty obviously clear when we sampled the hemlock adjacent to the site, it was statistically significantly higher concentrations of chloride in the hemlock needles at the pond outlet and the seep. And then over time, we have just been anecdotally monitoring those hemlocks, and there is just complete die-off adjacent to the salt storage facility. So our conclusions, we're definitely exceeding the freshwater standard for chloride in the wetland, which isn't classified as the receiving water body, which is why it hasn't really triggered any problem, because the monitoring point is about a kilometer downstream from the site in a stream that's rather large. So the numbers at that monitoring point are low. Soil concentrations of sodium indicate potential cation exchange, although more information is needed. The permittee and their current modeling and monitoring efforts by the state are indicating that there isn't a pollutant problem essentially, but it just shows the importance of like the selection of the monitoring site, because you can get a completely different answer depending on that. And that the improved monitoring is really needed, both in terms of frequency, the media, like water versus soil, and the location of those. And what we really think is interesting here is that this is a modern permitted site. It's fully covered. They actually are doing a bunch of groundwater monitoring. They have a stormwater pond. And despite that, they are exceeding the freshwater standard. And so there's obviously a need for some kind of effective controls for these kinds of sites. And which brings us to where we want to go from here and the new effort that we're doing. So our question is this a special case, or is this really the way it is? I suspect it's not such a special case. And does the manner of storage, because many salt storage facilities aren't covered, aren't on impervious bases, have different soil types, does that make a difference in the export? And so in this, and Dana's very proud of this graphic that he made up for us. So phase one is what we're engaging in this coming year, is installing upstream, downstream conductivity probes at publicly owned salt storage facilities. Many of them are not as like well designed as the one that we had been monitoring in Shelburne, to see the differences. And we'll be doing it on smaller streams, so you can really pick up the signal in the receiving water body easier. And then as a phase two to that, exploring the influence of subsurface versus surface flow, as some of this water or the chloride we know are moving through the soils, and it isn't just coming in directly from the surface, and determining what the most significant pathway is, and if soils are an important feature of that or other features that are important. And then as a result of that, hopefully recommending improved siting, housekeeping, and physical site characteristics to reduce salt transport from what we identify really as a point source of salt, which is unlike the diffuse road networks that otherwise are getting a lot more attention.
Great job.
We did it. Yeah. Oh, we do?
Wow.
So to have questions. So
Cool.
Awesome.
I'm gonna help find the.
Okay, I don't know how to put
tell
these.
you all my questions.
I'm really good at the all tabs, so you
Do you
just
just
let me
jump
know.
right in?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, happy to take any questions if anyone has any. Thanks. Yes, Cree.
Cree.
Well, it just seems to me, from what I just heard about monitoring of receiving waters versus point of discharge. I don't really understand what really needs to change to get a more accurate reading of contamination of any kind. The point of discharge at the La Platte River Marsh is the wetland. It's not the La Platte,
Right,
you know.
Yeah,
the
Columbia.
stream.
right,
How do we correct that? in statute?
right. That's a
Because
question for
that's a-
some,
that's an
Karina knows the
important,
answer. to that.
Distinction that I just. heard,
Yeah.
Receiving waters versus
Gotcha.
point of
Okay.
discharge.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And, you know, our naming convention might not make this clear enough, but when we say pond outlet, we really are talking about the wetland. It is not the discharge point from the, which is different. It would be higher there. We are in a receiving water body. It's just the wetland is a receiving water body versus the stream. And you're right. We think that's a critical point. And the paper that we referenced really focuses on that. That's really the focus of it, is how can we improve this, where the location of the monitoring is, because that is the problem here. And that is why this site isn't being indicated as exceeding the standard, because the monitoring point might as well be in the Atlantic. Mm.
Not to expand.
Yeah, Chris.
With your future sampling, will you be looking at cations and trying to sample those and look at the soils with those?
It's a good question. No, not currently, no, that's just not what we have funding for. We would love to. We have been stymied by efforts to try and get funding to do this research. And we have had this data, so, we've been collecting continuously since 2018, have tried Basin program multiple times, Sea Grant multiple times. And we just really, there hasn't really been an interest in funding it. So if anybody wants to look at cations, we'd love to, but yeah.
I mean, that's one of the reasons that we wanted to convene this symposium in a way, because we've been living in this world, and we know a lot of you have, and so, bringing together what all of us have been doing in a more coherent way to raise sort of awareness of this, because I think we've spent a lot of time in the past several years on phosphorus, rightfully so, flow issues, flood resilience, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that one of my greatest fears as a citizen and a researcher is that we ignore this issue. So we fix phosphorus, we somehow figure out flood resilience, flow issues, other pollutants, that sort of thing. And then we wake up one day and we realize that we've literally salted our streams. And so all of the phosphorus work we've done to eliminate HABs is completely negated by the fact that now we have the Atlantic where the Lake Champlain used to be. I think that's a little dire, but this is a quieter issue, obviously, in the state, and I think in the basin. And so we're trying to categorize it better with our micro scale research here. And then the macro scale stuff that the Basin program is doing it's really inspirational to see this level of attention at this point. All right, off the soapbox.
Do we have time for one more, Chris?
Not really.
Okay, we'd love to catch up. Okay, sounds great. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. There we go. I got you.
Yes. Oh, it does actually work.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Becky and Dana. Really great job in sharing multiple projects. And I have, just for you to know, Becky and Dana, somebody reached out to me who I don't think is here today, Deb Naher, who has published a couple of papers that are on the handout that relate to soils and vegetation and might be a good resource. Through the Gund is that connection. Okay, now on to our next presenters. So we have a great contingency of folks here from Middlebury College, some of whom are standing next to me. And so really pleased to have, I think we've got Molly, Costanza Robinson, and Eric Moody. And then are all the other co-authors here too?
Not all of
Okay,
them, but
all right.
most of them, right here.
Okay, fantastic. I will turn it over to you all to talk about the sources and ecological consequences of salting urban Champlain Basin streams. And the pointer apparently does work.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to get started. Thanks all. Thanks so much for organizing this, Chris and Dana. Unlike some of the other talks, this is really beginning research. So we're not going to show a whole ton of data, but a little snapshot of what we're seeing. And I'll give us a plug that will be at the Northeast Aquatic Biologist meeting next month. And so we'll be presenting there. That's in Fairleigh, Vermont. So it looks like a great meeting with a lot of salt stuff. So hopefully we'll see some more of you there and we'll have more data at that point. But I'm Molly, I'm an environmental chemist at Middlebury College, and my colleague Eric Moody is an aquatic ecologist, and we've teamed up on this work. So I'm not going to go through the background, salt's a problem, salt. But where our work comes in and is a little bit different than what we've heard of so far is that we're really focusing in on land use within the Lake Champlain Basin and how that relates to salinization. So looking at the magnitude and seasonality of that stream salinization, we're also looking in rather small headwater streams, not some of the big tributaries. We're going to be looking for the dominant source of salinization. So of course, road salt is a really dominant factor, but we will also, wastewater treatment was mentioned, we'll be looking for those signatures chemically and looking at some other possibilities that might be contributing. And then the effects of salinization, we're focused on stream macroinvertebrates. Just to give you really quick methods, we delineated effective watersheds using stream stats and calculated land land cover types using the 2019 NLCD. And urban land use is the sum of any and all urban, developed categories within that data set. So this is just a preliminary metric, and there's a number of others that we'd like to explore, like impervious cover and linear lane miles and others as well. But again, we're at the start. So these are our 11 sites that we're looking at right now. 3 of them have just been recently added, and so that we don't have as much data for them. But this graph shows the different land use types that are represented. So if it's towards the bottom left triangle, that's forested land use. Over here is on the bottom right, urban land use, and at the top is agricultural land uses. I'm giving you just some ideas, some pictures. Forested Snipe Island Brook is our reference site. So the watershed does not have any that we know of developed land within it. Our most urbanized, or among the most urbanized sites that we have is Centennial Brook, which drains the airport. And yeah, pretty much, yeah, kind of right here. And then Old Stone Creek is our most agricultural site, giving you a sense of some of what we're looking at. So here's just some quick data that we have so far. So we've been sampling these, I forgot to say, for about 1.5 years, but the more agricultural sites only since July. But we've organized the different sites on this x-axis in order of increasing urbanization, and the y-axis is the log of conductivity. And we've put just a guidance level there that is for receiving waters near mining operations to give you a sense. And as you can see, as we move to the right, urban land use really is a strong driver, and we've done some basic stats that says so as well. Predominantly urban streams, so the 4 darkest colors, the most urban streams, most purple, always exceeded the salinity guideline every single day that we've measured for the last 1.5 years. And then agriculture also contributes substantial salinity. So the ones with the stars are our most agriculturally predominant watersheds. And you can see they sort of bump out on top of that urban trend. So I think of it as the agricultural bonus of salt. If we look at our sites, I'll just go back real quick. This color scheme will carry throughout. So the lighter colors are the more forested, the darker colors are more urban. Here we're looking at those same sites, but by month of the year, starting back in June 22, continuing through October. And again, specific conductivity on the y-axis. So our urban sites show a very strong salinity spike in winter, not super surprising. But what was maybe more distressing to us is that the urban land use driven salinity persists even in summer. So if you can still see that color trend in those areas, and I'll zoom in on those, just those summer data in this next slide. So this is the urbanization driving conductivity even in summer. And our most urban predominant watersheds exceeding that guideline even in summer, every single day. So we're interested in that summer salinity because of the potentially greater ecological impacts, but also, as others have suggested, it's interacting with the soil and suggesting this salt surge in the soil and or the groundwater. So even if we stop salting our roads today, we have built up a legacy that will continue to seep into our streams. At this point, I'll turn it over and welcome Eric.
Yeah, so a lot of the work that my lab has been working on has been focused on monitoring the benthic invertebrate communities in these streams and trying to understand how they respond to salinization. And let's see. What we've been doing is looking at these invertebrates as indicators of water quality. And so we started sampling in the summer of 2022. We sampled the 8 non-agricultural streams then, and those are the data that we have that I'll be presenting today. But we sampled 3 times this past year, and now with our project moving forward, we'll be sampling them 3 times every year for the next few years as well. And so we look at who's there, look at some diversity metrics and metrics of the community composition. So these are the data from the summer. And so what we can see on the y-axis, I've got the taxon richness. So that's essentially how many different taxa do we identify in our samples versus the median chloride concentrations that we've measured from the summertime in these sites, with the red dash line representing that 230 milligrams per liter chronic criteria that Dana and Becky mentioned. And so the sites, sorry, I didn't follow Molly's color scheme. We had to go rogue, but they're still coded by percent urban land use in the watershed. And so what you see is a pretty sharp decline in richness with increasing urbanization or increasing chloride concentrations. That is pretty evident there. And so that, is statistically significant, perhaps not surprisingly. But what's, really important, and we're not the first people to notice this, is that you start to see effects, well below the that chronic criteria. And so, this could be due to effects of chloride at lower concentrations, but these are urban streams. There's other things that are likely to be impacting the invertebrates there. And so there's probably a combination of stressors that might be causing those declines in richness that we're seeing. We have looked at the community composition, so not just how many species or how many taxa are present, but which specific ones are present. And we're really interested in doing this to get a better sense of what taxa might be good indicators of chloride or salt pollution. And so we do see there are significant differences in the community composition. So the composition varies across this chloride or urbanization gradient. And there's several taxa that really fell out as sort of good indicators of chloride pollution. And so these are some of the mayflies are particularly salt sensitive. This is Baetis. If you like bugs, you can get to know some of your friends. Paraleptophlebia is another mayfly. And this riffle beetle, which is like, the size of the point in the eye in real life, but very gigantic in this slide. So these are all things that really decrease in abundance very predictably as salinity increases. Something that we're really excited about doing, and we've started some pilot work with, but we'll be really doing a lot with going forward, is using this experimental lab system that we've built at Middlebury that we call the Extreme. And so this will be used to test sort of individually the effects of chloride versus other urban stressors like temperature, dissolved oxygen, that might be influencing these communities. And so we can really get a better sense of how chloride pollution specifically might be causing some of the patterns that we see in the field. And so like one of my students, Catherine, who's not here today, did a project where she looked at these mayflies, Femarella, and she exposed them to different chloride concentrations in the system for a week, and then looked at their metabolic rates to see, she's interested in whether increased energetic costs associated with osmoregulation might explain why these particular organisms are so sensitive to salt. And so she found, especially once you started to get up to some of these higher, and these are below the chronic criteria, but higher concentrations of chloride, there were definite observed increases in their metabolic rates. And so this suggests that this might be a reason why we see some of these declines in some of these mayfly abundances in salt polluted streams. And so this is something we're going to expand on in the future. We're going to try doing these kinds of experiments with other aquatic invertebrate taxa and other de-icing agents as well, to start to get a sense of how toxic they might be. So to summarize what we've done so far, we've found that urban land use and road salt use appear to drive the salinization of these urban streams in the Burlington area in Vermont. Agricultural land use is a secondary driver. And so as Molly called it, we get this sort of bonus effect of agricultural land on chloride and conductivity. what's really interesting to us is that this salinity persists even in the summer, long after any salt has been applied, suggesting that the soils and the groundwater are a sort of long-term source of salt, and this might be having really strong biotic impacts during the summertime. And as we see, there's lower diversity of the macroinvertebrates in these salty urban streams, and the taxa that are present are often very different than the ones that we find in the more forested streams. And as I pointed out, mayflies tend to be one of the most sensitive groups to salt pollution. We found the same pattern in our stream, and this has been reported in other places as well. And we're starting to look at some of the mechanisms as to why they might be particularly sensitive to salt pollution. So as Matt mentioned, we're really excited because we just got funding for a new sort of extension of this project through the Lake Champlain Basin program. So we'll be first working through our sample backlog. As you can imagine, we still have a lot to go through and things that we haven't reported yet today. But we'll be continuing the sampling for at least the next 2 years and hopefully much longer than that. So they'll be continuing some of the things that we have just talked about. But we'll also be doing some new additional things in this project. We'll be using chemical fingerprinting to get a better idea of what the sources of the salinization are. So are these de-icing agents? Is it the water treatment facilities that I was referring to? How is agriculture contributing? We'll be looking more at high frequency data. So we're going to be installing conductivity sensors in these sites, as well as some other sensors to get a better sense of how weather events and other types of patterns and what causes salt runoff into these sites. And when we see these peaks in conductivity. And then, like I said, we'll be using this Xstream, the lab system, to tease out some of these effects of other stressors and salt on the biotic communities. And so we're really excited. We've got a great team. A lot of students have contributed to this work, and a lot more will be contributing over the next few years. We've also gotten a lot of help from folks at Middlebury and some of our collaborators in Nebraska. And with that, we'd be happy to take questions about our project. Yeah, there are. Some of the most obvious ones are hydrocyclid caddisflies, the net spinning caddisflies. If you go to like Centennial Brook, you just are walking through a mess of caddisflies almost. They seem to just do really well in those conditions. Some of the crustaceans, like the amphipods and the isopods, we find a lot of in urban streams. That might be a temperature effect as well as a salt effect. And then there's some other like fly larvae and some other things that we do find at higher abundance in those sites. Yeah, Dana. Not that we can tell, but we're really in the early stages of this, so I think we'll learn more as we start to get more samples. I could certainly imagine how it could allow more salt tolerant species to invade, but I haven't seen any clear evidence of that yet. Yeah.
currently our data, we go out for grab samples every other week and we do an in-stream there. Going forward, we'll have really high frequency every 10 minutes or so once we have the sensors installed. Yeah. And maybe I'll just add on at this point, in terms of other measurements that we are doing going forward, and this relates maybe to Becky's stuff on soil. So with the water quality that we'll be measuring in the lab going forward, we'll be doing base cations, anions, DOC, TDN, but we're also doing heavy metals. And so we're looking at that as a potential ion exchange flushing into the streams through ion exchange. So Ella, who's here, is doing her senior thesis right now on just the bare bones, like beginning to understand whether ion exchange is really happening. And are we seeing that flushing of both the base cations and potentially toxic metals into our streams? And then we'll also be looking at the heavy metals in the invertebrates and seeing if there's any bioaccumulation. So we're really excited about that as well. All right.
Okay, another question about summertime. Are you guys looking at temp and precip as drivers of like summertime base flow, like how that fluctuates? Because we've seen a lot of it, like when it rains, you get lower concentration, like creeps up and dries out. Like, is that something you're also kind of scoping out?
Yeah, we'll be gauging these we'll be looking at discharge going forward. We don't have those data yet, but we see that exactly. We were out yesterday and then conductivity was remarkably low. It's just a lot of dilution. So for sure, that's really important. And that's part of why we see remarkably high levels in the summer. In actually some of the less urban streams, the summer levels are higher than in the winter if you look up close. And it's because of that dilution effect in the winter coupled with lower inputs.
2022 was a really dry summer, so we had, since it was so dry in 2022 for like June, July, that's when we saw some really high values. But even like after the big floods we had this summer, I mean, these were headwater streams that weren't as impacted, but they bounced back pretty quickly. The conductivity did, so. Yeah. Yeah, Chris. Yeah, the Snipe Island site it's near a dirt road. The rest of them are paved. Well, some of the ag sites are.
Yeah, the ag sites. That's part of the source attribution that we'll be looking at is dust suppression salts could be present as well. Yeah, that's something we've learned from folks we've been talking to that was unknown to me before. So, yeah.
Thanks so much, Holly and Eric. Yeah, if you don't know, there's chloride used in the summertime as dust suppression, and that's why I was wondering about dirt roads and impacts that might result due to that kind of thing. Thank you very much for that. Really interesting to think about the life and the fact that the salinity is staying high year round, not winter is happening. So our next presenter is Blaine Hastings with the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation, talking from a monitoring perspective of the total maximum daily loads or the pollution diets that have to be created for whatever is polluting our waters and the monitoring that he's been doing related to that.
Hello. Yeah, again, I'm Blaine Hastings. I am a hydrologist with the Vermont DEC's Watershed Management Division. Yeah, I'm talking about kind of our method for approaching chloride TMDLs. So it's less a specific study with specific results, but kind of the playbook for how we're going to approach this as a requirement of the Clean Water Act and EPA. So just, is this touchscreen? Let's do enter. All right. So before I get ahead of myself, TMDLs, if you don't know, it stands for total maximum daily load. And that's the maximum daily or annual load in mass of a pollutant that a water body can receive while still meeting water quality standards. This is a EPA Clean Water Act requirement most of the time for improving conditions when a water body consistently does not meet standards for a particular pollutant. So the main task for developing a chloride TMDL, first we at DEC, we confirm the impairment, and then we look to characterize continuous water quality conditions. And the next is developing a long-term daily or sub-daily stream flow data set that we then use to derive a representative flow duration curve. I'll get into all these later. And then we apply the flow duration curve to the Vermont chronic chloride standard. I'll show you how we do that. And that establishes this target, what they call a load duration curve. And then finally, I don't know why it says 2 at the end, but the fifth is establishing an annual chloride TMDL target. So why this approach? It's based on methodologies that are in already approved chloride TMDLs in New Hampshire and Virginia. New Hampshire, they have several, 5 or 6, but that's the only chloride TMDLs really in our region. And there's only, I think, 3 states that have done this at all. So there's clearly more than 3 states that use chloride and de-icing, but it's surprising how few there actually are. So the low duration curve that I mentioned, it's actually recommended by EPA to use for setting chloride loading targets. And our approach is site-specific and data-driven, you'll see. So the task 1, confirming the impairment, we use biomonitoring in our, we call the assessment and listing process, where we collect data, look at it, and determine if the aquatic biota, specifically, if they do indicate that a stream is impaired. And if it's listed as impaired, generally, if it's listed as impaired for 2 years, that's triggered, or that says it's impaired, and it would trigger the TMDL process. And identifying what the source of the issue is, we use supporting chemistry, grab sampling data that we collect or the ROSA collects. And specifically, if it points to a chloride issue, we would, go ahead. Oh yeah, that's a good call. Sure. All right. So, and that table is just an example of some metrics looking at aquatic biota. Red, you'll see it shows non-support for that particular site. No, that's not going. I think so. No.
So this is what you get when you touch things. Okay. There you go.
Got it. Task 2, characterizing that continuous water quality. We talked about grab sampling versus continuous monitoring. So we would deploy, we have done this on some sites already. We deploy continuous conductivity loggers and then producing a 15-minute time series of specific conductivity during the period of interest. And also we've noted that summer low flows tend to have the highest concentrations. And then with that, we collect a series of chloride samples over a range of the observed specific conductivities, use that to derive a site-specific conductivity chloride regression, and that is used to model continuous chloride over that monitoring period. And the top graph is a statewide chloride conductivity relationship, and then within that, there's just a few site-specific data points that fit pretty much. In Vermont, it's pretty tight relationship. It's not true everywhere, but everywhere we've seen, it's been pretty tight. Some sites are better or worse than others. So anyways, once we have our chloride concentration data set, we look to identify water quality exceedances. And we already talked about the standards, 860 for acute, and that's for a 1-hour period once every 3 years. And the chronic is 230 over a 96-hour period once every 3 years. And I think it's hard to say like what's one violation, because it goes up and down, it can last for weeks. So I like to think of it, we calculate the percent of time the chloride concentration was above a standard. And you'll know the bottom one, that's the 96-hour rolling average chloride, and it does show that negative relationship with flow. The blue line is flow, and then the orange and green are just two sites. Every time the flows go up, concentrations dip. And we see that most everywhere. So 3, we want to develop a long-term daily stream flow data set to get our flow duration curve. And that's the challenge, because there's not flow data everywhere. Ideally, it has at least 10 years of subdaily flow. So sources of that in order of preference, if there's an existing gauge that has all that data on the stream, great. USGS, ours, or UVM has some data. You could do a record extension where if you have a short record and then an overlapping longer term record at another site, establish a relationship correlation, use that regression model to get your 10-year model data set. You can do a hydrologic model, calibrating various ways or using nearby data. And yeah, I already mentioned we often see that negative relationship, and those charts are just mean daily chloride against mean daily flow at a couple example sites. So we develop a long-term daily flow duration curve using that long-term data set. And that's flow duration curve is just the exceedance probability. So the probability that a flow is equal or exceeded within the data set. So you'll see that the 50% exceedance probability flow is only about half CFS. 1 CFS is only exceeded about 10% of the time. So it's a way to characterize the full range of flows at a site. And then we use this to derive the load duration curve. And this is the crux of getting our loading target for the TMDL. So for each day in our stream flow data set, we multiply the flow of that day by the water quality standard. And in fact, we use 90% of the water quality standard, which provides a margin of safety. That's a requirement for this process. And then so for each day, you know the load that would be below the concentration, would meet the water quality standards. So the period, your entire period of say 10 years of flow, for each day in that, you'll know the load that would have a concentration that meets standards. And that's your load duration curve. And here you'll see green is a target load duration curve. At those loads, concentrations would meet standards. And then that black line with the red observations are actual observed. And so you can see what percent you need to reduce to get to your target. And it's helpful. You can look at different flow categories, like what's the percent decrease at low flows versus high flows. And then we finally established the annual chloride TMDL target load. So you have, you take the total amount of chloride, the load, for your entire period, and then you just divide that by the number of years in your data set, and that's your annual target load. It's pretty simple and straightforward. It assumes imports equals exports, or that all the chloride leaving the watershed via that stream is equal to the amount brought in. Might not be true on an annual basis, but that's the assumption since chloride's conservative. And it's mostly for de-icing. It's, as we see in Vermont, most of the chloride source is de-icing, but that's not strictly true. It is for the sites that we've looked at so far. And then just the common de-icer is rock salt, which is 60% of which is chloride. So if you had, say, a target of 100 tons per year, you multiply it by that 0.607, that could be your target tons of rock salt that's used on an annual basis in the watershed. And I think that is all we have, which hopefully leaves time for questions. Lots of time for questions. Okay. I'm fortunate enough to have some of my colleagues here from DEC that also work on this. So I may call on them to answer some of the questions depending on what they are. So, yeah.
What would the other states that have TMDL?
New Hampshire had several, Virginia, Fairfax.
Yeah, what would be the
It's de-icing.
Oh, really?
Yeah. They noted that the delivery and the high concentrations happen mostly in the spring and right after snowfall events. But yeah, they did. And the other was Minnesota, the Twin Cities area has several.
New Hampshire's had one for a while. Back to the DOT or well, the context. Everything here is the municipality.
Yeah.
I'm an RPC. I play county. So like, what's the impact if New Hampshire surviving under the TMDL?
Yeah, that's complex, and the TMDL process, a lot of the requirements stop at setting that target load, so there's not a lot of like required follow-up monitoring to see how effective it is. They did establish what they called, I believe it's the Green Snow program, where applicators, usually private contractors, can get certified in methods that use de-icing more conservatively. But I don't know if there's been much follow-up to see how effective that's been. And then the elephant in the room with all this is, of course, implementation. How do you say who can use? I think that event, maybe I'll have Tim clear. He's our TMDL coordinator. He knows a little bit more.
No, they don't have like a quota. They have it actually allocated. And they've been a little resource restricted in actually following up.
Yeah.
So I think it spurred some action, like this, like reduction of use, some usage, investment practices, and things like that. But there's not a lot of accounting that's been done to show what.
Mhm.
So they're coming at it from a use reduction perspective. If we can. Oh, okay. Oh, it does work. Yeah, New Hampshire's coming at it from a use reduction angle. But they haven't really tied that very much to how much reduction has occurred and what the in-stream conditions have been. So, and given the variability of winters, it's hard to say. It's hard to, on a short time scale. It's really hard to say what changes have occurred. So,
yeah, and I do know in their TMDL report they said moving forward they were going to establish like a road salt work group that included state transportation, towns, private applicators, this whole group of people. Like, how do we tackle this? Like, what's required for a parking lot versus a highway versus a town road? And then they were just kind of sort that out through that group for those TMDLs, but I don't know the details on how it's gone. Matt?
Okay. I have several questions. I might just find you after, but
Sure.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. So because these would be like EPA regulated TMDLs, correct?
Yeah.
So you would have to use the EPA criterion.
Yes, for the
For chloride.
concentrations, yes.
And have
Which
you
are the
heard?
state.
We just heard the rumor, more than a rumor. We've heard from EPA that they're going to be revising the criteria. Okay, so good.
Yeah.
By the end of the year, is the draft's going to come up at the end of the year.
Okay.
So, I guess making sure you were aware of that and wondering if you're like if your methods are flexible and you're like kind of ready to shift to what might be much more like possibly an order of magnitude lower.
Yeah. Well, as far as coming up with that load, it's only the step of multiplying each day by a concentration. So if that concentration is
like
100,
mathematically not a problem.
Yeah. No, click of a button and you'll have a new
Sure.
target.
Okay.
It's really the confirming the impairment and then getting flow data together. That's the big lift.
Great. Maybe I'll ask one more. Okay. Or is there one up there? Oh. Go ahead.
I was just wondering what sort of time frame the state's on actually getting the impairment.
Well, the impairment listing already exists. We already have several streams are listed as impaired for chloride.
Like it's like several, not as many.
What is actually out there? Yeah. So we already have a handful. And the past few years, I've done the continuous monitoring on a few streams and just capacity. We're only about 3 streams every year, and 3 of the streams from 2 years ago are pretty likely going to be listed as impaired. I did 3 this year. They didn't show exceedances, but it was a very wet year. So we're sort of hashing that out. I don't know. We're just kind of picking up steam with all this. And as much as we can, we're going to move forward. The listing cycle is every 2 years, Tim. So
yeah, we'll be adding a few more streams this cycle.
2024.
We'll be adding a few more streams in the 2024 cycle coming out this spring in the Burlington area. So, where we're seeing hits of high chloride, we need to really document it as kind of a legal regulatory aspect of our work. We need to really document that there's an impairment there. So Blaine's continuous data collection does that, but that's kind of resource intensive to do that. But those are the steps we have to follow to, make a legal impairment, let's say. So it would be nice, and I think some of the work at Middlebury, perhaps, if that's data we could ultimately use, because that's going to be pretty concentrated data. I think that may be useful to kind of augment the work that we can do to identify actual impairments above the water quality standard. Well documented data that could be useful for the state.
Do you use what's collected at the La Rosa through the La Rosa partnership and all the watershed groups in order to identify with the streams?
Yeah, for the initial cut.
Yeah.
The ROSA data is very helpful for that. It's not, the ROSA data is not quite robust enough to make a listing call because we need a longer time frame for that. But it's great for that initial cut, and it points
Identifying the hot spots.
Yeah,
that we would-
it makes our continuous data more efficient.
Matt, did you have one more or? Okay.
Well, you have like, wait a second, 2 minutes and 57 seconds.
Hi, Blaine. I was wondering, you touched on the imports equaling exports,
Yeah.
which is something I'll actually touch on in a bit, but do you have any case studies on that where that was matched or there was some increases or decreases?
No, we don't have great data,
Okay.
like observed data on what's applied. VTrans does a good job at that, but private applicators, parking lots, even town roads, we don't have for a mass balance, we don't have a good solid number of imports. It's just an assumption.
Mhm.
And for some watersheds, it might be more true where it is like rock salt or something, but for the other sources like septic or wastewater, industrial, it's a whole different way of trying to account for what's coming in. So if you limit it to the de-icing, it's
Yep.
a little more manageable to kind of
Thanks.
approach. All right.
I'm looking at Matt.
Now I'm a little scared. You didn't want to say it out
A
loud.
minute and a half. Here we go, Blaine. Okay, this is really, hopefully you can just help me and other people understand how TMDLs work and can work in different ways. So obviously they're not all daily loads. Some are annual,
Yeah.
and some are for concentration, some are for loads. So what I don't really get is we have like a body like Lake Champlain or 13 segments of Lake Champlain that have a annual maximum mass, right, for phosphorus.
Mhm.
But for chloride, we're talking about concentration exceedances.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not so are you planning to only have TMDLs for those exceedances of concentration, or have you considered looking at receiving water bodies?
I don't know if Tim, we would approach it kind of separately. Like if you need a TMDL for Lake Champlain because it exceeded, I guess maybe like, and I'm a little maybe out of my depth here, but the phosphorus load drives the blooms and the impacts, but right? Or
Well, that's not really. That's one of the problems
Yeah.
with the TMDL
Okay.
for phosphorus. TMDLs definitely have limitations, but they're useful, right?
Yeah.
So there are like different types of impacts for chloride. There's the loading, and that's for the lake, but then the more day-to-day impact would be for biota, and that's concentration
when they're
driven.
living in that
And then,
concentration.
but what drives loading are the higher flows, but that actually decreases concentration
That's
in the
right.
stream. So they're
That's
almost opposing. So you almost need
You have to
both.
treat them differently, I guess. Like you're cleaning up one brook. These are very small streams.
Right.
But if you did lake TMDL, you'd have to address them all. And yeah, I don't know. It is an interesting sort of juxtaposition. But I don't know, Tim or any. We're thinking about chloride from that. Yeah.
So you're trying to manage road salt. That's a load, and find that protective overall load hopefully your concentrations follow. And there's a lot of assumptions there, and I think the mass balance question is a good one. How conservative is it, and what time frame is it conservative? 100 kilograms in a small given watershed would keep for the year. That would keep the concentration at the effective level, but there's the question of when it's applied, and that's only 4 or 5 months out of the year. There's a lot of questions that are still unknown at this point, so I think that's a big gap.
Mhm.
I'm going to say that till the
Why
end.
we're here and interested to know that.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Blaine, and thanks everybody for this conversation. The big gap, remember that there is a place online, of Google document that you can write down what gaps exist if it makes sense for research. You can also feel free to write it on any of the flip charts you see around this room, and we will get into that later as well. So thanks, Blaine. Thanks for the conversation, everybody. Really interesting things to think about. We're going to welcome Dana Allen back again. Stephanie Hurley couldn't be here today, but Dana is going to take it on for both of them to talk about a recent project that they worked on around salt storage facilities and drinking water sources.
Thanks, Chris. I had my timer up. Whatever, just yell at me when I'm overtime. Hi, everyone. I'm back again. Stephanie couldn't make it today. She got stuck in Florida, and then she had a sick kid. So both of those things sound pretty rugged to me as a childless person who has never been to Florida. Sorry. Okay, so what we're going to start with today, we mapping Vermont's municipal salt storage facilities with respect to drinking water sources. So if you get nothing from this talk, at the end of it, you'll hopefully understand that we created a novel geodatabase of salt storage facilities in Lake Champlain Basin in Vermont. And then we looked at wells and public water sources around them to determine if there was a risk to a lot of different wells or public water sources. So that's essentially what this talk is about. I'll probably run way over time because it was like a 40-minute presentation initially. We had some funders. We really appreciate them. Thank you. And some great collaborators. We're going to skip over that real quick. Okay, so we created this database, like I just said. We mapped out all these salt storage facilities. We also then used the state's public database to get private wells and public water source data from that. And we also used this really amazing tool that was put together by UVM, some researchers at UVM who were in that first slide that I skipped over, called the Vermont Environmental Disparity Index. And if you're not familiar with this tool, get familiar with it. It's really a great tool for looking at environmental disparity and risk factors for vulnerable populations. We did look at school proximity. I'm not going to talk to you about that very much because it wasn't very interesting. And then we've got some locations and descriptions of facilities. We're going to talk about down gradients of wells and water sources from some of these facilities, and we'll get at what do we mean by down gradients and how good a job did we do with that. And then we've got some conclusions and next steps. So as you're probably aware, we use road salt in Vermont, and we're not slowing down. Chemicals in these de-icing materials can pose a risk to drinking water through liberation of constituents like lead and also copper in older plumbing. And this is bad. We thought we'd solve the lead thing by telling kids to stop eating paint chips. And it turns out that if we salt our water and then we have lead pipes, that also has a risk to health. So we're not just talking salty water here, and like there are impacts, real public health impacts to de-icing salts and other, chloride pollutant sources. So we want to get at this. Like, that's why we're looking at this. What wells are close to some of these facilities, and does that matter? So de-icing material pollution is typically associated with roads in the wintertime, although we're seeing summertime has an impact as well. But storage locations are basically a point source. They're there all the time. They might be leaching materials. Becky and I talked about this a little bit with our research in Shelburne. Now we want to know, okay, does this exist statewide? How bad could it potentially be? Or is it not that bad? And prior to this study, this was sort of shocking to me as a GIS nerd. We live in Vermont, which has a very robust GIS database, and like there are a lot of contributors. There was no map database of these facilities. So we created something new, which we're really proud of. I'm super proud of it. I created a database. So anyway, we basically wanted to survey all these. I'm going to skip this. You know what we're trying to do. Okay. So Municipal facilities mapping. How did we map these? Did we go and drive around and try to find all the salt piles? Absolutely not. We basically called all of the towns in Vermont. That was our undergraduate research assistant, who's very diligent. And we called all of these places. We called town clerks. We called road foremen, typically between the hours of like 5 and 7:30. And that's how we got that database. And we gathered it all up in a database program, and voila, now we have GIS. We also talked to VTrans. They gave us their locations. And so we didn't field verify any of these locations. We did look at satellite imagery. We could see generally, yeah, it looks like there's a town garage or a pile or something like that. But we did not drive around. So take the database with a grain of salt. Thank you very much. Okay, so private wells. How do we get at private wells? Well, ANR has a great database of this. It's drinking water wells. It's also monitoring wells, geothermal, all kinds of different things. There's about 110,000 reports dating back to 1966 or 1969, somewhere around there. So it's a very big database. Is it perfect? It's absolutely not perfect. Some of them are spatially not located correctly. We're probably missing a lot of wells, frankly. But with 110,000 records, it's the best thing we've got going. So incomplete data may exist, mileage may vary. The state's drinking water database also has public water sources. And so that's all like public water sources are kind of, they can be wells as well, but it's like for larger developments or communities. So like the town of Waterbury has one, like we have deep bedrock wells that are located way up in the mountains. So things like that, we're also talking about surface intakes. So if there's like some sort of surface intake or something in the lake, that would be in this database as well. So we looked at all of those just to see what we'd find. All right, now we talked about down gradients, or I talked about down gradients. And basically what we mean by this is like something up high and there's something down low. That thing down low is down gradient from that thing up high. Now, one of the things that we're talking about here is the fact that like we're talking about surface facilities, salt storage facilities on the surface of the ground. And then we wanted to try and figure out like, okay, well, what could come from that facility and get into a well? Well, what we figured out, let's see if I remember this, is topographic gradient a surrogate for hydraulic gradient? So basically that means if the surface of the land slopes down, is that a proxy for how the groundwater moves? And the answer is maybe. So in this case over here, let's see, I'm gonna use the laser pointer. Topo equals hydraulic. What does that mean? Well, basically when rain falls on this slope, all things being equal, it's generally gonna follow the gradient of the land, right? Because there's nothing getting in the way. So it's gonna go down and then it's gonna also follow gravity down this way. That's pretty basic. Well, over here, see now we would expect that the hydraulic or the topographic gradient would send water this way, but what if there's a bedrock fracture or some other barrier? Well, topo doesn't equal hydraulic here. What's up, Chris? Oh yeah. That's fine. I don't worry about it. So anyway, all this to say that like this is a case in which topographic gradient doesn't equal hydraulic gradients, right? There are other instances of this as well. Stephanie put this together, so I don't know. Let's see. Okay, surface water, there's your groundwater mound. Okay, there's your facility location. That's your salt storage facility. Now there's a well. It's topographically uphill of that facility location, but that well goes down into the groundwater. So what happens when this facility, maybe it, spills some salt on the ground right here, that's going to get into that groundwater, and then that's going to get drawn up into that well. So all of this to say, we chose a method that we thought we could relatively easily implement using topographic data. It's not perfect. So when we say something might be downhill, that's a big maybe. So again, another grain of salt. So basically we just used the state's LiDAR data. We assigned elevations to all of these facilities and all of these wells and water sources. We also used 5 selection buffer distances of 30, 60, 100, 200, and 300 meters. The reason that we chose 30 meters is that this is generally the distance at which like you will see impact from de-icing salts to wells. That's been documented in roads and other studies. 60 meters is basically a wellhead protection zone as per Vermont DEC. So when you drill a well, you generally want to have an isolation zone of a couple hundred feet around that. And then we added 100, 200, and 300 meters to broaden the search radius because we weren't getting a lot of wells within 30 and 60 meters, which is kind of a good thing. And so then we were able to create a series of maps. We did this for, I don't remember how many times, I'll tell you in a second, but we can see that we have this facility in the center of these buffer rings. So that's let's see, that's a covered facility, municipal covered facility. We have our buffer distances, 30, 60, 100, 200, 300 meters. And then we have wells, and we've coded them. So some of them are topographically lower than the facility. Some are topographically higher than the facility. And so that's how we coded the data. Notice also too, we have these black lines here. Those are the National Hydrography Dataset high resolution catchments. And so basically that's the finest scale watershed that we could pull to basically determine where drainage breaks occur. And so we used those to also select wells. So if we had a facility within an NHD HR catchment, you'll see that term a bunch in the paper. We then selected all the wells within that catchment and then determined which ones were lower or higher than the facility, because that's another good proxy for where water generally flows and where it's not going to flow. So beyond this drainage break, we wouldn't necessarily expect to see water flowing from this facility across that drainage break. So that's why those were selected. And we also applied a little bit of a buffer distance to our selection for those catchments to account for ridge lines or flat areas where the facility might be affecting one or more NHE catchments. God, it's so nerdy. All right, the Vermont Environmental Disparity Index, I'm not going to go into it in great detail because I don't think we have the time, but suffice it to say, this is a novel product in the state. It basically lumps together a bunch of social and environmental factors at the census block group level to assign essentially risk to vulnerable populations. Keep in mind, this is at the census block level, not at the town level. So if we want to look at town by town data, we have to assign these values to the towns, which is ultimately what we did for some of our analyses. But this is a really great product, and it gives us a way to start to look at, is there a connection between a lot of private wells near one of these salt storage facilities and their relative environmental risk? Spoiler alert, we didn't find that there was. So yeah, I said all this stuff. So we talked about joining the data. We're not going to talk about that. I think I hid that slide and then I forgot to send it. Okay. What are our results? Well, there are basically 126 municipal boundaries in the basin. There are a couple of GORs, which are unincorporated. A couple towns shared facilities. One town told us that they didn't want to play in our sandbox and to go away. 2 towns did not respond. So we basically got 122 facility locations over 118 towns. And this is the overall map that we put together. Note, blue is covered, orange is not covered. And it's hard to see at this scale, but the majority of facilities in Vermont are covered now. And a lot of the uncovered ones are salt and sand piles. So that's actually great news. So 4 towns have a couple of facilities. We basically have 170 individual material piles, of which 21% of those are uncovered. They're mostly salt and sand. Some are sand only or sand and gravel. One was initially listed as uncovered. It's mag chloride, but if you don't cover mag chloride, you don't get to keep it. It will wash away. So that's actually covered. So that's a good thing to keep in mind about this, is that general best practice is if you don't cover your salt piles, not only do you potentially cause a pollution problem, you also lose all your salt. So it's in your best interest as the town to cover them. VTrans data, we got all the data for VTrans. There's 124 facilities across 63 towns. We didn't get specific attributes for any of these facilities as far as whether they're covered, whether they're sitting on empty pads or not. VTrans states that all piles are covered and on pervious pads. Cursory examination of satellite imagery proves that that's probably true. We didn't ground truth any of that. So what are we looking at for material types across the basin? Mostly road salt, sodium chloride, 102. Salt and sand is very common. Potassium chloride, magnesium chloride, so 2 of the lesser known de-icing salts, not very common, unsurprisingly. And then we had some calcium chloride, which is usually liquid and stored in tanks. Most places have had their salt storage there for 10 plus years. Most are covered in a structure, although some use an impermeable membrane. I've said that word for years. I still can't say it. Tarps or other plastic covering, probably not the best way to cover it, but it's better than nothing. And most are on pads. 45 are not on pads. And so that's a bit concerning because even if something is covered, if it's still on some sort of pervious surface, you've definitely got a vector to get into groundwater. So that is concerning. One was listed as pine boards, which I thought was really interesting. It's like, we definitely live in Vermont. Most were asphalt and concrete or compacted earth. Again, compacted earth makes me a little bit nervous, but could suffice in a pinch. But overall, it seems like most people are using best practice to store these things. Keep in mind that when Becky and I were talking about our study in Shelburne, we're talking about a very modern facility. That's asphalt, it's covered, they have good housekeeping practices, et cetera, et cetera. And we're still seeing a lot of salt leaving that site. So even though I'm kind of being optimistic about this, most sites being covered and having pads and that sort of thing, I'm nervous. I'm nervous, which is why we're doing other research. So anyway, the well results. There's 1,600 plus private wells within 300 meters of these facilities or within the NHG HR catchment, and 44% of those are topographically downgrading of the nearest facility. So that's a fair number of wells that are potentially within some sort of risk zone. What is that one? That's yeah, whatever. We're gonna skip that. Most are not within 30 meters. So that's kind of why we ended up broadening that search radius. But we do have 15 wells within 30 meters. And those ones would make me especially nervous. Like if I were going to do a study of any wells in Vermont to see if there's any sort of impact, I'd probably go out and find those 15 wells first. And then I'd progress to the next 46. So that's inclusive of the 15 before it. So there are 46 within 60 meters. Those ones I'd like to look at. If we're going to do some sort of study of this well water, this gives us a good starting point, and then we can go out from there. So we have, up to, nearly 600 wells within 300 meters. So there are also 51 public water sources within 300 meters or within within a catchment, and 63% of those are down gradient. So again, we have a decent number of sources, public water sources, that we could potentially consider monitoring on some level for a potential impact from some of these facilities. So we put together these maps. We shared these with all the towns. The response was underwhelming. I'm assuming they all received them. I did send them before Christmas. So who knows what happened. But anyway, we basically coded the data. So we have these muni facilities, covered, not covered, VTrans facilities, private wells higher and lower, public water sources higher and lower, and then all of our boundary buffers there. And so then we have some of these maps. So let's see, what are we looking at here? Alberg. Alberg's facility is uncovered, but there are no wells in proximity or within the catchments. That's not always the case. We're looking at the town of Chittenden. So we have a covered facility, but then there are several wells that are, above and below that facility within the buffers and within the catchments. You can see the catchment for that one is fairly small too, whereas the one for Alberg, that's a fairly large NHD catchment. So sometimes you catch a lot of wells with those catchments and other times you don't. And then we have this interesting case in Westfield where we have a municipal facility over here. Then we have two VTrans facilities located side by each. So you get a little bit of overlapping buffer. But overall in that one, not a lot of wells within that particular area. So basically we just made a map series that we could share as part of this report and with each town if they were interested. And I didn't seem super interested. The Vermont EDI, so we did a comparison here. And so, okay, so we had this idea. We're like, all right, is there a relationship between the EDI ranking and the distance, the average distance between the wells and the nearest de-icing material storage facility? And so we basically ran a near analysis, got an average for that from the wells to all these facilities. 2 minutes. All right, I'll stop talking. There was no relationship. You can see from this chart that it's all over the map. So there's really no clear relationship there. So while the EDI is super valuable and our data is valuable, we couldn't really parse out any sort of relationship at this point. We did some stuff where we kind of like lumped the distances into different cohorts to try and find a relationship. So that's that short, mid, and long distance. Nothing popped up there. Our values were terrible. And then we took the top 25 most at-risk towns on the EDI and tried to figure out if maybe we'd see something there. We did not. I will say that I still think that using this EDI as an overall indicator of risk could be a potential way to start looking at some of these towns and maybe looking at the wells in proximity to these de-icing material storage facilities. Because, you know, these are generally communities that are more at risk. So maybe we can help these communities with their siting of their de-icing facility. We're not talking about schools. Basically not talking about anything more. Okay. So we made a spatial database, which we think is really cool. And also I think that, you know, regardless of the research that we did and the conclusions that we drew from this, we created something that other people can build on. And we're hoping to eventually get funding to do this for the rest of the state so that we finally have a comprehensive database of salt storage facilities in Vermont that can support other research, things that we haven't even thought about yet. So that would really be great. So we did this initial assessment to drinking water, which we think is really nice. And then we also used the Vermont EDI in another application that its initial researchers maybe didn't think about using. So overall, it was a good first step. But we have to improve this. The down gradients issue is something that we want to do, or we want to try and figure out if there's a better method. Sampling and testing of some of these wells, and then creating a larger database. Could we do this for New York and Quebec as well as the rest of Vermont? This could be a valuable product for all the regions. And then got some other ideas, but Chris has given me the eye. So anyway, I'm gonna stop talking. Thanks.
I'll allow you to answer one question while I flip over the presentation. How's that sound?
That sounds great. If anyone has a question, Becky?
Where can people access that?
Oh, thank you. It's on the mapped data is on the Vermont Geodata portal. You can Google it and it'll pop up. And then Tim, did you have a question? Okay, yeah, it's on the Geodata portal. Eric Engstrom helped us out, which was great. So Molly, since Chris is still flipping.
Yeah, I'm curious about schools, which you didn't talk about, but I'm also wondering whether you can look at data because they have led data.
Yeah, that's actually the great thing about schools is that they do already test their water supplies for those schools. So yes, we didn't look at that specifically. We didn't dive into that. And it turns out that like in general, most schools are not in proximity to any of these facilities. Although it was a somewhat cursory, basically we searched the well database and the water source database for school to draw out like what school water sources might be in those databases. And then just looked at those in relation to the de-icing salt facilities. And there weren't that many. I think the closest one was like hundreds of meters away. So there's not much in proximity. I can go over that more with you. Yeah. Yeah, because Chris is like,
I got
hey.
the evil eye, really.
Okay. I'm sorry.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Dana. That was really great. And obviously making questions be generated, which is fantastic. So the last presentation before we take a little break is Chris Nowitzki. Jim Sutherland couldn't be here today, but Chris is here to represent the pair. And he's going to be talking about their report on the project, the monitoring project to evaluate the New Hampshire, right? New York State Department of Transportation's the road salt reduction pilot program. And so I can't wait to hear what you have to share with us.
Thank you, Chris. And Jim sends his regrets. He really wanted to be here, but was ill. I love working with Jim, but he actually has the longest titles for any presentation. So it's nuts. But so why focus on road salt? We all know, but in Lake George, and I hope most of you know where Lake George is. It's the southwestern corner of the Lake Champlain Basin, and it does send the best water to Lake Champlain. But over 40 years of studying, threefold increase of chloride levels in the lake, mostly due to road salt de-icing. Correlation, as has been mentioned earlier, surface area of roads to chloride loading. That was done by Dr. Mark Swinton, who's right here in the front row. This led to our approach, Science to Solutions, where we actually started meet with municipalities, started working with them to reduce road salt, started an Adirondack Road Salt Working Group, and started putting pressure on DOT. And also with an individual well study by Dr. Kelting, that brought along DOT to commit to a pilot programs, one near Lake Placid, one in Lake George. And this is a quote from DOT. I want you to remember the quote. "We are committed to working with stakeholders to reduce salt and retain the parks, the Adirondack Park's beauty for generations to come." So DOT was all aboard, wanted to do this. So and right away, this was May 2018, we put together a work plan and said, DOT, let's work together on this. You committed to it. They wound up not working with us, but their proposal was to reduce road salt by 10% reduction on a 17-mile stretch, basically along the western side of Lake George. At the bottom of the map, you see Lake George Village, and it goes up 17 miles to about the midsection of the lake. Our proposal was to create 2 test watersheds within that pilot area, and then 2 controls, because DOT said that they would reduce it on the pilot stretch, but then outside of that, use their basic standard practices. But that wasn't the case. So here's our study. We initiated it right away, 2018, even though DOT was dragging their feet, because we wanted to get data before the actual quote unquote pilot started. Again, 4 tributaries, biweekly sampling, anions, cations, gauging the streams, taking samples, and then eventually we put in continuous data collection in the streams. Here's a picture of some of the watersheds. This was very tough because we wanted to isolate it to watersheds that only had influence from state roads, and also that there was no upland influence. So really limited where our sites were. So we did find 2 in that 17-mile area that there was no we could get sampling up gradient of the state road and then down gradient, but there was no influence from development, no influence from town roads or county roads. So these were the 2 areas that were in the pilot study. And then these were the 2 controls that were outside of that. Tributary 41, which is English Brook, one of the largest tributaries to Lake George. We had a little influence from the Northway, but the Northway I-87 is maintained by DOT. So we were able to include that. So these were the study watersheds that we had. And we were comfortable with them because you can see this was the first 4 years of our study. Blue is the upper station or the background levels. They were all around 0.5 milligrams per liter. So we were very comfortable with those background levels. And then you can see what the concentrations were just on the other side of the state highway to see what the influence, and you can see they varied from a 9-fold increase up to 80 times increase. So obviously impacts from road salt. We got into the continuous monitoring and data collection, hobo conductivity loggers. So we set those up and put them in the streams, and you can see our setup. We actually, Halloween of 2019, we had a different setup. We lost a couple of those. Those are huge storms. So then we changed it to this, and then we also use the in situ aquatrolls, where those would measure levels, and then with our gauging, we could set up the flow gauging curves. Also then started using the Bluetooth to download those aquatrolls. Here's a setup of the conductivity loggers, the second setup, which we put on concrete blocks and then started tying them off to whatever we could next to it. And then obviously the level data logger controls, the aquatrolls. So we recorded every 5 minutes intervals on 24-hour synchronized times. We downloaded those bi-weekly, put them into a Excel master file, And then also with the in situ level controls, we also put in the program for the barometric pressure to account for those impacts. So here you can see we are very, very comfortable. This is the chloride versus specific conductance. We're very happy with these graphs. You can see the R values very good, 0.95, 0.97 of 2 of the watersheds. The other 2 were just as good. These are the rating curves for the tributary flow versus the level. Again, very strong curves. We were very happy with all that. You know, it's always difficult because these streams, a couple of them were pretty small. So how do you gauge those higher flows? We tried to get out there as whenever we could when we had those higher flows, but we were still very confident and comfortable with those. So we get that. Now your eyes will blur for a couple slides. So the green columns, the one on the left is the levels. So we had the levels, we had a rating curve, so we could get our volumes and we could get that in 5-minute intervals. The green column on the right, that's our specific conductance, tie that to the chloride, and then we could get the actual loading of chloride in pounds every 5 minutes. Boom, you're really blurry, but this is our monthly totals. So we know what's going on. We know what the loading is in these streams, and we're very confident. But as Blaine kind of talked to earlier, and that was my question, we need to know what DOT is putting on. So that's where, again, remember they were going to work with us on this. Well, they weren't very forthcoming with their application rates. Took 2 years during the FOIL request to get that from them. The first batch of data that we got from them, they actually sent us the entire road application for the western half of New York State. I think they didn't think we were going to look at it. We like Route 30, this is by Buffalo. We wanted 2 small or 4 small segments in Lake George. Oh, God, no one there really knew their data management system. They had no standard protocols that they were going to apply as they said they were in their work plan. They actually had 2 different application management systems, a SNOMAT, which relied on the drivers to put that in. And then there was the AVL, which they said they were going to use. That's the automatic vehicle location, where it would record whatever the truck applied in every 20 seconds or 30 seconds or 1 minute, whatever they set that at. That's what they said they were going to use. They barely use that. And then there was errors, especially with the driver input on the SNOMAT. So very difficult to get the information from DOT. And we needed that because we needed to know what the salt loading was by DOT to check it on the streams to see if there was actually an improvement. So a couple things to know before we get into our data. Road salt application period, RSAP. Basically, that's the winter season. We went from November 1st until October 31st. So that, and they basically added salt from first week of November into April. The lane mile, that's what it is. It's a lane mile, but a mile of a single lane during the study. So a 1 mile segment of a 2-lane road actually is 2 lane miles. An application event, that is actually when a truck goes out and does a complete route and comes back. So you could actually have multiple application events during one snow event. That's pretty important. And then clear lane, that's actually the treated material that New York State DOT uses. That's important because they add magnesium chloride to that. Why is that important? That's got 2 chlorides. So it actually has more chloride than standard sodium chloride. So getting into, these were the evaluations of each watershed. The first 17, 18 was before the pilot, 18, 19, and so on. We had continuous monitoring from 2021 21, 22. So that's when we really focused on that. And this gets into that import and export. So in this one watershed in the pilot study, 70% of the chloride applied showed up in the streams. And then in 21, 22, it almost reached that input equals output, 91%. So those were pretty good. The next watershed, again in the pilot, 99%. So that almost completely mass balanced out. The 21, 22, 75%. So again, there was not as much chloride in the streams as what DOT had applied to the roads. Now, going to the quote unquote control, this was our largest watershed, English Brook T41, a 6-fold increase of chloride loading in the streams as compared to what DOT put down on the roads. 6-fold, 21, 22, 4-fold. We started thinking, wow, what's going on? And then we'll get to what our hypothesis is later. This is the other smaller control watershed. Again, a 4-fold increase in that first 20, 21, and then much closer to that balance, mass balance, but still an increase of chloride in the streams as opposed to what DOT was putting down on the roads, according to DOT's own records. So remember, DOT was going to reduce application rates by 10%. So again, 17, 18 was the year before the pilot went in. And you can see, you know, how high the application rates were. These were the average rates, again, by DOT. The first year of the study, 18, 19, you can see that significant drop, and you can see the percentages every year. So they did what they said they were going to do. Reduced it by 18, 21%, all the way up to 33%. So DOT did reduce their application rates. However, what we found, again, this is from DOT's own data, 17, 18 before the pilot started, 18, 19 the first year, you can see these are the application rates during the RSAPs, the winter season. So that first year of the pilot, they were consistent, but the next 3 years, you can see significant increases in the number of trips that DOT made, 3-fold increase. So they reduced their application rates, but they were going out 3 times as often. So what did that mean? So we started calculating what the total chloride loading was. And what we found that first year of the pilot, 18, 19, again, compared to 17, 18, they actually reduced chloride loadings in the streams by 45% in the test pilot area, 26% outside in our control areas. However, after that, when they started going out more often every year, significant increases in the chloride loadings, well over 2 to 3 to 6 times as we had in that one watershed. So conclusions are, as we said, DOT did what they said they were going to do. They reduced their application rates by 45% in that pilot area, and they maintained that. The second bullet gets back to that import and export. Our hypothesis is that certain watersheds in the basin have a greater depth to the bedrock where these soils can actually retain the groundwater, retain that chloride that's in there, and actually allow that to accumulate. And then in certain years, depending on precipitation, may actually lead to export of chloride. And we get an increase in chlorides as opposed to what was being put down. Basin road salt reduction pilot began, and they held those number of trips, those application events, the first 2 years, but then significantly increased that. Was that due to safety concerns? Was that due to complaints? We weren't sure. We didn't get answers from DOT. And then therefore, combining the reduced application rates with the increased application events going out, that led to significant increases in the chloride loadings in the watershed. So really, they did not accomplish what they set out to do. So our next steps, we want to advocate for the Adirondack Road Salt Task Force recommendations. That's a governor's appointed panel that Chris Stefanuck and myself were on, put out a report. DOT's been rather quiet on that one. We want to continue our monitoring program. We're still doing that. We're going to monitor DOT practices. And in fact, I want to say I have a 16-year-old daughter who just got her driver's license. One of the things I'm filing a DOT truck. This would have been on the way driving her to school. Now that she can drive herself, I can actually use my cell phone and take pictures of a truck. I don't want to teach her bad habits, so obviously I wouldn't use that. So anyway, that's just a funny thing about that. And then continue to meet with DOT. We met with them, we showed them this report, and they never got back to us for about 4 months, 5 months. We say we're going to go public with it. I actually have copies of this. It's a rather thick report, but be glad to share that with you. And acknowledgements, want to thank the Sea Grant program. They funded the first couple years of this study, Jim Sutherland and others. And I do want to thank DOT as well for being a partner. And any questions? I don't know if I'm over. Good, great, thank you.
Chris, do you know, what was the methodology for creating the salt reduction? There was a method on the truck apparently that could be controlled.
DOT had several things. They set out the practices, the typical ones. They were going to brine more. One of our chapters, we evaluated that. They actually didn't brine. They brined about once a year during this stretch, this 4-year period. They were going to use better plow mechanisms, the live edge plows or the 2-stage plows, which had the behind. They were going to use the AVLs, again, track what they were putting down and go over that, record that. They were actually going to evaluate the road, see where there were cold spots, maybe cut back the canopies because it's in the Adirondack Park. There's concerns about cutback, removal of trees, things like that. So those are some of the things that they were going to do to try to reduce their road salt. Yes. Blaine.
Do you attempt at all to characterize or some metric for winter severity, what
Yes.
the weather would call for different application?
Absolutely. We do have a chapter in the report on that. I did not include in here, but we looked at actually DOT on one of their management sets. They did have a severity index, but that was very scattered and it was only for 1 year. So then we went to the local municipal treatment plants because they monitor the rain as well as the snow, incorporated that. We didn't see any impact on that. We went to NOAA's snowpack data set that they had to get the snowpack as well as the moisture. That really didn't have an influence. Those last 3 years, which are the last 3 winters, not including last winter, so the 3 before that, those weren't as severe. And actually it was the 1920 that was the most severe. That did not have an influence on that at all that we saw. And we actually, in some of those graphs or charts that we actually had chloride per precipitation. So we actually did try to take that in and break that down. So. No one else? Cookie time. Thank you.
All right. So thanks, everybody. Let's take a few minutes break. We were set to start again at 3, but let's So the way that the rest of the afternoon is looking, so the presentation, I have a presentation to share, and then we're gonna do a magic IT thing, and we're gonna have Sawyer Bailey share her presentation remotely, but we'll see how this works. We have a backup if it doesn't work. And then we'll break into these kind of conversation groups. So just putting it out to people to be thinking about if you might be willing to be a leader of a conversation group. We were thinking about trying to break into 6 different groups to have kind of smaller conversations around the gaps in knowledge. And so if you are someone who would be feel comfortable facilitating a conversation among a small group of people, I would love to have a couple volunteers. I know Matt and I were on board for that, but if we're looking for like 4 other people, so it would be great if some of you would be willing to do that. But to get us going this afternoon, I'm going to be talking about, I'm starting my 20 minutes here. I'm going to be talking about some surveys that I've done with various people. I will say that they are more kind of assessments with one exception, and I'll explain that as I go. That is more what I'll call research. So the 3 surveys that were conducted, the earliest in time was looking at and talking to private contractors in the basin. And I'm not going to talk about that one today, but I will say we just got a paper published. Holden Sparacino and Stephanie Hurley and I just got a paper published last week. And so it is available free for download and on the handout in the back with all the publications. If you look under Sparacino, that there's a link there, and I will send out following today an electronic version of that handout so you can access that link. It's available for free to download until mid-February, and that's about the private contractors in the basin. And I will just say that the other 2 surveys I'm talking about today kind of echo or mimic what we learned from the private contractors, which I find great. It's nice to see that there's consistency across the different entities of professionals who are doing management of snow and ice in the winter. And kind of what we were looking at is what are the practices that they're using? What do they think? What are their motivations for changing and to use reduced salt best practices? And what are the barriers that they face to reducing salt? So I will talk today briefly about the other 2 surveys, looking at campuses, and that not only across this basin, but across the US. And that related to a road salt reduction task force that exists on our campus. And if you did walk across campus today, I don't know what's happening, but we are not doing a good job with it. And we've been talking to the task force about what's happening there. And then the other one is municipalities in Vermont and in the Adirondacks, and that was in partnership with ADK Action. And then also counties in New York, because there's a county management of roads in the Adirondacks. I did cut my results a lot, so you're just going to get the snippetest of snippets about these different surveys. So for the campus study, what UVM wanted to know is what are other colleges and universities doing for their snow and ice management? What problems are they facing? The driver that got UVM interested in thinking about road salt reduction was not the environment, not that they don't care about it, but they see things happening with the infrastructure, and it costs a lot of money to replace, for instance, a historical building's door. You have to have the same facade. It can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to replace one door, and they were seeing a reduction in the lifespan of underground structures, say for steam fittings and doorways, rugs, everything you can think about is kind of a half life cycle. So they wanted to know what was happening on other campuses. Are people using unique practices? What can we learn from other campuses? So we surveyed land grant institutions across the kind of the northern part of the US and all of the universities and colleges within the Lake Champlain Basin. We got about a quarter of the folks that we reached out to respond to the survey. So again, I pared down to kind of just the basics. We know everybody out there is using sodium chloride or salt, the traditional road salt. And then about half, just about 60% of the campuses are using sand. And then people were talking earlier today about the other kinds of forms of de-icers that can be used that are chloride based. So magnesium chloride and calcium chloride are used by a smaller percent, like 50% or down to 30% of campuses. Those have an an exothermic reaction, so they can be used at colder temperatures than sodium chloride, but they are more expensive. And then we saw relatively small percents of the campuses using liquid brine or a salt water mixture that they might spread ahead of a storm. For instance, proprietary mixtures from various entities, or a calcium magnesium acetate, which tends to be much more expensive. We asked them about the kinds of damage and places that they were observing challenges based on salt. And we know the number one place, almost 90% of the campuses said that their stairways were being degraded, but also they observed sidewalks and vegetation impacts. And then smaller percents, about half, saw impacts to their doors and floors, as well as their underground piping systems, which again, this campus has seen. The top right picture, you can see I think it's stalactites, is that right? Comes down from the top, coming down in that underground storage tank, and also sort of degrading of any of the stairways and the metal structures underneath the surface. But also building facades, particularly on the historical buildings or other kind of fancy fronts. And then I think the surface water quality, a number of the respondents said, well, we're not looking at that, but a couple of them said, well, we know that there's surface water quality impacts on our campus. What I found really interesting is about 3/4 of the campuses used what's called anti-icing. So they were going out ahead of a storm to put down salt or some other kind of products. And so thinking around, I think it has to do with timing of when their staff are available and what they can do to prepare in advance and have things kind of ready for when a storm hits. I'll take that as what's going on our campus today. I don't know if that's true. And then 2/3 of the campuses said that they try to do some education to get people thinking about winter and wearing the right footwear, and thinking about what we need to do to have a safe walk across the campus. Just under half had some kind of a written strategy on their salt use. And then smaller percents were using pre-wetted or treated salt. And I'll say that that's considered a best practice. And we have a really nice example from a municipality here in Vermont this year, Hyde Park, where they've actually reduced their salt use by 40 to 50% over the last 3 winters by using pre-wet salt. The way it works for the municipality is it reduces the bounce off and the scatter of the dry salt. And so they can put it down and it stays in place. And then they've been able to reduce the number of passes that they need to do. So it's one that I was curious about. We did the survey before knowing this, but that campuses could use something similar to try to reduce the use of salt. And then only about 30% using kind of alternatives to NaCl. So I'm going to hide this thing here. Okay. So this word art is, the larger the word, the more often something was said in terms of the question. So we wanted to know what the barriers were to reducing the salt. And the number one thing was campus user expectations. That is what stops the people who are doing the management from limiting their use of salt. But you'll also see things like the Americans with Disability Act. So making sure that there's accessible places for people who have disabilities. People just simply not being trained or misusing the salt, and having, you'll notice too at the bottom that there's not a problem perceived. So some people who I surveyed said, it's fine. What we're doing is just great. How did you fix it? I think I got it. I got it. I win. Yeah. I don't know what I did, but I win. Yeah. And then I asked them for suggestions for how do we break down these barriers. And the number one thing that they said is educate. We need to educate. We need public education. And I'll tell you what, that's what we heard from contractors, and you will see it in a minute. We see it from the municipalities and the counties as well. But people also talked about minimizing the area that is needing to be cleared, so that if you close walks, or you close a stairway, then you don't have to put salt on that space. Having online classes or training. So that really goes along with education, trying to get people to wear the right shoes, and asking, using alternative products was something that people were considering. Is there something that we can do differently? And I know that this campus has been researching different kinds of concrete and heated mats and other kinds of ways to think about not using salt at all. In terms of the drivers of salt use, liability concerns were really the driver. So I had the blue is this is a great extent. This is a concern to a great extent or somewhat or a little bit or not at all. So you see liability concerns are really driving people's actions. Campus users not being prepared, about half of the people who answered. So that's kind of a big driver. And then salt is making it simpler. If you put the salt out, and again, this is where I think the anti-icing, doing it ahead of the storm, you put the salt out, it buys them time. They don't have to have staff come in the middle of the night or at 3 a.m. or at 4 a.m. So it buys people time. It makes life easier because the salt is kind of there already and you can count on getting a little bit of time out of that. Okay, shifting over to municipal and county. So this was an interesting one where we started with a survey that went out electronically to about 230 people in New York counties within the Adirondacks, within New York municipalities in the Adirondacks, and within Vermont municipalities. We got, it was about 23% response. I will say we followed up calling people about a year ago and ended up in a little conundrum with Dana's survey. People we were calling said, well, we've already done your survey. And I said, oh, no, you haven't. And they said, yes, we have. So there was a little confusion there because I didn't realize till we started calling that we were doing it at the same time. So take it with a grain of salt. That is why I have the same thing. Same joke. It's okay. But here's what we know. Same kind of picture we saw on the campuses, where pretty much everybody, if you go to kind of middle here, dry rock salt, everybody is using in the Vermont municipalities. I guess I should give you colors. The gold is the New York municipalities, the greenish is the New York counties, and then the darker burnt orange is the Vermont municipalities. So in Vermont, municipalities are 100% using dry rock salt. In comparison, dry rock salt, New York municipalities, only about a third of them are using that. They are all mixing their salt with sand in some way. And then all of the New York counties are using sand. And then you see a lesser percent of the Vermont municipalities, about 3/4 using that. And then hardly any New York municipalities are using just sand. I know that in Vermont, one of the drivers of that is that you don't salt in the winter a dirt road because that would not work. So they're sanding the dirt roads. And I think that's what we see a little bit of a difference. I'm not quite sure why the New York ones are less. But then drawing your attention to the right side of the graph, what we don't see again is people using this pre-wet rock salt. Only 16% to 33% are using that. And again, there's this potential that could save 40 to 50% use of salt. Brine is similar, that the literature suggests like a 25 to 30% reduction in salt by mixing salt and water and using that instead. But you see pretty low, like hardly anybody in Vermont, like one community is doing that. And then calcium chloride and magnesium chloride, again, those are ones that are used to get to a lower temperature. Sodium chloride can only be used to about 15 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is when it's cold out that you're seeing the communities use those other products. So on average in Vermont and in the Adirondacks, and I will explain this in a second, about 957 tons of salt per year are being used per municipality. So what does that mean? Or how do we know that? And this gets a little bit at something that Dana said earlier too, is we, in general, the communities are not, they're just guessing based on what they bought at the beginning of the year and comparing it to the end of the year. So this farthest left chart, the municipalities, about half of the New York municipalities and about 40% of the Vermont municipalities, and are estimating based on what we buy at the beginning and what we have at the end. And then all of the counties are doing that, but the counties are also they're using tracking devices on trucks. 2/3 of the counties are having tracking devices, but you see very few municipalities in New York or Vermont having tracking devices on trucks. And that's one of the first steps that I, as an educator, trying to promote them to do is if you don't know what's going out, then how do you know what you are saving at the end? So I think we have lots of room for growth. We're only 1 in 5 or so municipalities are doing this. And then doing a drop test to calibrate, that is helping them to know how much is going out at any given point in time. So it's another point of education we're trying to suggest and promote. So 20 to 30% of the municipalities are doing this. So there's lots of room for improvement. And then there is at least in Vermont, you see about 1/3 of communities reporting that they're actually not tracking their use of salt at all. Okay. So in terms of the best practices that they're using, the top things that we saw is people using adjustable equipment that they can adjust the rate of salt output, and that's high percents, 78 to 100% across. It's M is municipality, C is county for New York, New York, C is county, and then Vermont. They're also covering the salt products and also using equipment. Oh, that's the one I already said. So adjust and actually adjusting. So they have equipment that can be adjusted and they are adjusting. So just to compare New York municipalities to Vermont municipalities, I'm only going to focus on the words at the top, which is the top row of the chart. So basically the motivations for New York municipalities to reduce salt, number one thing that they said was driving them was to protect human health is why they would reduce salt. In Vermont, their number one driver to reduce would be to limit the costs to themselves. Health was number 2. It's close. It's not really that different. It's pretty close, but it was top was reducing costs. And then for the barriers for reducing salt in New York, we saw the biggest barrier was liability. So same thing we saw on the campuses. And in Vermont, same thing. We're looking at liability concerns being the biggest driver for people not reducing salt use. And so then asking people about what would be really useful to help encourage salt reduction among the communities, funding to get upgraded equipment and new technologies like live edge plows or segmented plows or secondary plows or brine making equipment so they could start pre-wetting. 70% of the communities across the whole basin said that this is the number one thing. Here you see again public education. So everybody's saying we're being driven by people's expectations and demands on what we're doing. And so we need the public to understand. And also I will say supervisors to understand what's going on and what we need to do to do better. And then staff, having more staff was a third most common. So the takeaways is that there's a lot of room to grow in terms of encouraging these various audiences to think about best practices, one of which could be pre-wetted salt that's going to stay better in place, or brine ahead of the storm. I think the communities are not so interested in brine, but the campuses could be. Tracking use of salt is something that, again, to promote across the board so that people know what they're putting out, and also the calibration. And then trying to help the communities obtain funding for updated equipment. And we've had really great communications. Dan's here and Chris is here from the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission. We had some really great conversations all with Chittenden County and Lamoille County around shared brine systems, and trying to work with them to pursue having them be able to test things out, like shared equipment that allows them to test things out and see if they really want to invest. And then there's differences in motivations for reducing salt. So we can target our outreach based on people's motivations depending on the audience. And then public education is being asked for from all of our professionals. So I think it's something for me as an outreach professional to be able to take that and move forward. So I have 1 minute and 40 seconds left of my 20. Would anybody like to ask a question about any of those things that I just shared? Sure, Cree.
Do you know what some of the roads in Vermont are dirt? And the other question is,
So two questions because Jill, are you sitting over there? Can you grab that microphone and if people have questions, give it to them? And it just has a slide on, turn on. So Cree asked the percent of roads in Vermont that are dirt and what is it costing to get the brine equipment for Hyde Park? I don't know the percent of the dirt roads and I'm looking at Dan and Chris. Do you guys know?
I have it in my head, and don't quote me, but I think the number is there's twice as many unpaved roads as paved roads.
Okay, so Chris is saying twice as many unpaved road as paved roads in Vermont and not to be quoted. Right, they can't be salted in winter, but they are salted potentially in summer for dust control, but not in winter because it would gum things up. So they aren't. And then the cost for Hyde Park to get set up with their brine, they initially had a borrowed, like a secondhand one from somebody, but the new one that they just got is about $100,000, and I think it makes 6,000 gallons an hour. Does that sound right? Something like that. They're sharing it with other communities as well as themselves, but it's about 100,000. And they're also doing, they're tracking their salt use and they're doing pavement temperature sensors. So they know when they cannot use salt based on the pavement temperatures. So it's those devices, the calibration equipment, and then they have nozzles and hoses, as well as tanks that they needed. So it's all of that put together is about 100,000. Okay, and I am out of time, so thank you very much. Let me get
appearance in the room. Thank you so much, Chris, for pulling some tech wizardry. Thanks to those who are in the main room who are helping pull this off. And thank you to Hannah for your willingness to step in if anything goes awry. My name's Sawyer Bailey. I'm the executive director of an organization called ADK Action, and I very much apologize that I'm not there with you today. But this has been wonderful, and I feel very lucky to follow Chris Stepanek because she really queued it up in the best way possible, which means I can really skip over the problem. You are the folks who know it better than anyone, and I can really try to just tell you about the solutions we're exploring through our Clean Water Safe Roads program. To tell you just a bit about where we're coming from with this work, we work on problems that affect people and nature in the park to try to reach a sustainable future for the Adirondacks. We do a whole bunch of different things, but road salt is an issue that led to our founding, and it's one we're still at work on today. This is a big overview of all the different strategies we've tried. I'm not going to walk you through it, but mostly it just goes to show that anyone who's worked on a problem for over a decade, we shake our heads since we want more progress than we've achieved, but we're really buoyed by a lot of the impacts that we're seeing now with the great research that's been shared today. I'm not going to belabor how much land can fit in the park. You know it's big. The Lake Champlain Basin is a huge part of it. And we have some very interesting restrictions around how we can manage land here. But mostly we have a lot of water and a lot of private wells. And I'm so glad that we had the discussion earlier today about how road salt impacts private wells and impacts lead pipes. I bring up the Olympics here because that's when a lot of longtime Adirondackers will tell you that they noticed road salt was really an increasing issue in the park. Before that, folks really remember either roads that were not bare very quickly or a lot of sand being put down. There's a lot of amazing coverage in the Adirondacks that we've seen about impacts of contaminated wells. There's some agriculture on the outskirts of the park, and it's especially impactful to see how contamination has affected dairy farms. There are stories in our region of families who will either have water trucked in or will go to springs on a weekly basis and fill up jugs so they can drink at home. But you can't buy bottled water for a herd of dairy cattle. That's a quote that I never forget, and I think about these stories all the time. You all are scientists, and I feel a little silly throwing some data at you because I'm not going to show our work at all, but we were able to work with Paul Smith's College Adirondack Watershed Institute to test about 500 private wells for contamination, and we found that the majority of those came up salty and that levels were highest for wells downslope of state highways. Of course, this isn't anything new, but at the time it really confirmed an assumption that we were trying to test. So we see this as a multi-dimensional issue. Of course, it's affecting our aquatic ecology, but it's affecting our homeowner expenses, property values, quality of life, human health, dignity. And we saw an opportunity, a window of opportunity to try to get at this problem a few years ago when there wasn't as much state action being taken. And we saw this as something that we could tackle with our municipal and our county highway departments. And we've been lucky to work with Chris to better understand their interests, what they're already doing, what they're interested in doing based on her surveying. So what we launched was the Clean Water Safe Roads Network. This has 3 phases. The first is working to empower our local and county highway departments with the tools they need and the peer support they need to reduce road salt. The next would be reaching the driving public in order to create support for those advancements. We realize that if a highway superintendent gets a call at 7 in the morning complaining that their road isn't plowed the way they're used to, then it's going to be harder for those departments to sustain that kind of change. We want to build a culture of support for sustainability. So we've launched a public outreach campaign. And the last phase of this project was reaching contractors. And that's one we're just getting started with and we're really excited about. But we realized that contractors report to consumers, and we had to build a base of support with the driving public who could then ask their contractors for their private roadways or their driveways to do things differently. I'm going to tell you the most about phase 1 because that's the phase we've done the most with so far. We started with a very simple MOU that we sent around to all different municipalities across the park, but most especially in the Lake Champlain Basin, just asking them to sign on in good faith that this was an issue that mattered to them. And from there, we worked with Chris around surveying, and we gathered together really the early adopters, 6 municipalities and counties that were interested in actually engaging in workshops and trainings and having technical support that would allow them to really do more with less, manage their cost control to try to build some road salt reduction strategies into their work. We also equipped them with some water quality reports that would help them gather some baseline information. And then we've tried to help give them the tools for action. And that's where WIT Advisors, our technical partner, comes in. This is just a little bit about the maps. I won't belabor them because these were made by the experts at AWI. This was Brendan, Zoe, and the amazing contractor they worked with to build these. But really it's just trying to show where is your aquifer, where are your road networks? That one was no problem for our highway departments. They knew the roads backwards and forwards. But where are we pulling data around water and what is the impact on that water? So for every one of these maps, we had a long chart of mean, min, max, chloride, sodium, and an interpretation that would make this understandable for lay people. And really what we did is we just got into the garages. Standing up over here on the left is Jim Hogan and Phil Sexton. Jim is a real leader with the Washington County Highway Department who's been an early adopter of salt reduction. And Phil is really the main guy. I'm sure maybe Phil's in the room right now. I wouldn't be surprised, but I'm sure many of you know Phil and his team and the kind of rapport he can build with our roadway managers because he comes from a management background. So he's really built trust and relationships with the different municipalities we've engaged. And then he's helped hook them up with solutions and training. And it's been so deeply powerful. He uses a great kind of framework for continuous improvement. It's called SWIM. You got to measure what you're doing, better calibrate, prevent the bond, analyze storm instances, continue to improve and optimize. And we use a lot of tracking to help folks better understand what are their goals and how are they making progress towards them. He does a lot with the whiteboard, and this was a session last winter where we actually calculated how much is the town of Peru spending on sand alone, from the cost of the material to the fuel for the trucks that were deploying it, and then the time and manpower for picking it up, sweeping in the spring. And they were spending $70,000 on that. By fully eliminating sand, which is what they went to, they saved a lot of money that they could then put into better equipment around brining, live edge plows, giving their teams more of a pay compensation raise because overtime is a huge consideration for the crews. Don't want to lose access to overtime. And if there's ways to help them continue to bring home the same amount, they're more receptive, we found, to making changes. The town of Peru has just been an amazing innovator, and we've tried to bring good press to them whenever possible, so other towns, other residents can get interested in what they're doing. This is Tyler, their deputy supervisor, and he's just been a real champion for saying this builds camaraderie in a team. And to Chris's point, thinking about what is the road salt impacts on infrastructure, there's a lot of different avenues to getting interested in this work, and we've really tried to play up all of them. For some of our participating municipalities, we've just found that they're interested to solve a problem together. That feels good to them. It's motivating. After our first year, which was our pilot, 100% of our participants said they wanted to stay on for year 2. They all indicated that they measure more now. They changed some sort of policy in their shop, be it, how often are we calibrating? What is a designated speed a plow has to travel, etc. So we take that as good early indicators of progress. And this winter, we've actually scaled the program across the park, and we're working with over 20 highway departments. And we continue to have more interest all the time. So it's really exciting. We're working to increase the rate of reduction among our cohort members, and we're excited that we won a really new grant to help create a regional brining cooperative in the northern Champlain Basin. We're looking to equip our departments with some live edge plows, and we're hoping to continue to get more highway departments involved. We've also launched the second phase of the partnership, which I'll just briefly touch on, but it's creating the public outreach campaign. We wanted to do something that was a little different, that would get your attention, that would give you information and give you ways to take action, even if maybe you're not a science forward person. We called it Don't Be Salty. There's a lot of really, interesting programs across the nation, SaltWise, and others that are trying to get folks to be more salt conscious. But we've just felt that leading with humor is kind of a good way to do it. We've got a clean water pledge that individuals can take. We're sending out a lot of information about like social media forward facts, and we have a whole website for the campaign. The materials are where the fun comes in. We played on the Barbie movie, Brine Baby Brine, be part of the solution, don't be salty 80K. We've got some bumper stickers. We've got these salt cups that are designed to, more evenly and slowly disperse salt that we're giving away. And we're going to be tabling at winter events all around the Adirondacks this winter. We've got some winter carnivals that we're going to be going to. And we really couldn't do this without the Ausable River Association. They've been incredibly integral with vetting our science, helping us direct the campaign to make sure it never really strays from a strong science position, and to be able to share this with their network is amazing. We're really grateful to have them. I won't play it, but I will send along the links. Part of the campaign was developing a suite of videos that would be really attention grabbing and kind of exciting. This one features Hannah, and I'm not going to embarrass her by playing it, but we have 6 30-second videos and 1 2-minute long form video that really outlines the problem and the importance of solutions. So I'll put those in the chat for anyone on Zoom who wants to see them. But that's it. And I just want to say thank you again, Chris, for making this possible.
Magnets, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Yeah. Any questions? Oh.
All right, so I think the people in Zoom can hear me again, hopefully. Oh, sure. Are any of the towns in New York doing a regional brine thing? Actually, right. Hannah, do you want to answer that? Here, let me give you or Jill can give it to you.
Want to ask the question too, because they couldn't hear
Yeah, so he asked if any of the towns in New York are doing a regional brine making operation. And yes, Washington County has a brine making operation that they are sharing countywide. And then the Peru operation, they have offered to brine some of the surrounding towns' roads to show them how all the brine is working. And they're also establishing a brine making cooperative, which was the grant that Sawyer mentioned. Woo.
So Chris said in the town of Lake George, they set up a brining co-op as well. I think we're going to come borrow from you guys in New York.
Yeah, our organization provided a grant to the town of Lake George, and they now have set up a co-op working with the same consultant with advisors to have private contractors get educated, trained, and then also can get brine at a reduced cost.
Very cool. Any other questions?
Yeah, the challenge is that, especially for the small towns, it's that capital investment.
That's right. The capital investment. That's what we heard with the surveys.
And then you have to, the road foreman might know it's a good idea, but then they're always having to come to the select board. Well, we need to get a new truck, or we need to get more sand, or we need to get, and it's just hard, and there's so many pressures on the municipalities and stuff. And then here comes another thing. And then you do get the expectation thing is very, very real. People complain on Facebook or whatever, and how come it's not plowed? And so.
Absolutely. That's what we saw at the town of Peru. And that was one thing that they've mentioned, was that initial year where they saved so much in reducing the amount of sand they used. They actually completely eliminated the use of sand, which saved them a ton of money in cleanup in the spring. They could then invest that into their brine making systems and outfitting their trucks with brine tanks and sprayers and things like that. So they're able to make the case to their town boards and work that into their budget that way, which has been great to share with other municipalities.
And along with that, we found that it's about a 3-year ROI. So when it is an initial investment, the brine tanks and whatnot, but with the savings on salt, we found that it's about 3 years that they reach that plateau and they cover the expenses for the equipment, the live edge plows, the brine, the trackers with the reduced road salt. So that's about the break even.
And earlier Dana had talked about the municipalities maybe not being all that jazzed about the maps, but what I would say, my experience with them is they're really interested in talking with us. It's maybe more just that it's the mechanism by which we communicate is maybe not email and sending files, but going to the space to be with them. I think is a really effective, right? Chris, you look like you want to say something. Okay.
My role with the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission was recently very involved with the municipal roads general permit. And we did see DEC, who issued the permit, after a while start funding sort of like micro equipment grants for things that help roadway upgrades to deal with stormwater erosion mitigation, compactors, hydroseeder, stuff like that. And I think there's an opportunity for VTrans and or DEC to maybe do something like that, 80-20 match, the town throws in, 20% cost and VTrans funds the rest. But I guess this kind of leads into our last thing, like what research do we need to kind of support to say, hey, like this piece of equipment will reduce salt usage, or brine mixture will reduce salt use by X amount, to really help justify a program like that.
I think that's a good segment made. And I have confirmation from all of the facilitators that they're willing to come up here and share. In the Zoom room, I think y'all put something in the chat for us. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, so Matt, would you like to be first? All right, we want to come up or here, I can give you this. You want to come up here? Either way. Okay.
Thank you. Okay. Oh, say who I am. Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you. My name is Matthew Vaughn. Okay, so I'm reporting out for our group, We had a great conversation, a lot of good ideas. The top three kind of areas we were thinking would be good to prioritize were, one is just a question around TMDLs and how can we use TMDLs and different types of TMDLs for chloride. What could they look like in streams and in receiving water bodies? How would they compare to, say, the phosphorus TMDLs for Lake Champlain in terms of an action plan to achieve them in decades to come? So that was one area. The next one was this question of level of service. So there wasn't a lot about it today, but the cultural expectation that's evolved since the 1950s that our roads will be clear of ice and snow immediately following a winter storm. That was not the case decades ago, and that's the case now. So just understanding, what people's perceptions of those trade-offs are and what they could be, if you're looking at drinking water impacts and impacts to the environment. How willing are you to wait 12 hours after a storm, 24 hours after a storm? I'm making things up here, but ideas about, level of service and how that can change. The third area was BMPs. We're trying to think, solution oriented. How can we educate, get the word out about BMPs, make brine usage, brine production and usage more widespread, fund those types of initiatives. If basically all brine was, no dry salt was applied and brine was only applied for de-icing, then we'd have a direct reduction by 60% right away. So how can we make that happen? I think that's it. Did I do okay, my group? Okay, great.
You can pass the baton, which is the microphone.
Chariots of fire.
I'm gonna run around. Okay. This is Dana Allen. We're going through our group's topics. Chris put a lot of pressure on me, and so I feel really weird right now. So as far as BMP, we sort of started talking about BMP research and where are the gaps here, where do we want to see some more knowledge. And one of the things that our group keyed in on was this rate versus events applied, sort of based on Chris Nowitzki's research in New York. And what are we seeing here? So they're reducing the rate of salt application, but then they're going out more often. And what's going on there? What's actually happening? What's the real story behind that? Because we're going to sell some of these salt reduction methods or measures. Well, is it actually accomplishing what we want it to accomplish? And from the looks of things in New York, in that one instance, maybe not. So, and then looking at winter severity and its impact on application needs, timing, and then getting into optimization. So what are the optimal conditions to go out and apply what, when? Because I think right now we just drop a lot of particulate salt and hope for the best. And that's not working. We also talked a lot about brining cooperatives. That wasn't necessarily one of our priorities, but I think that's a big one here. We really liked this idea of the chemical fingerprinting, because if we're going to start monitoring and making management decisions based on what we're seeing in the streams, it would be a good idea to have some sense of okay, 30% of this is from de-icing salt, 70% is from ag. So at least we have some science to stand on as far as management decisions within a particular watershed. So the Middlebury research right now is super interesting. I think that's a great gap to fill. And then, finally, liability. This kind of gets to what Matt was talking about, level of service, liability education, and liability reduction or protection. So we talked a bit about what's happening in New Hampshire, or what has happened rather in New Hampshire with their liability or protection laws around the Green Snow program. And if that's something that I believe it is being talked about in Vermont or has been talked about for a while. I don't know where that conversation is in a concrete way right now. Perhaps someone in the room does. But I think this is a big topic that would be good to know more about. How'd I do, guys? All right, great. Thanks. The baton goes this way.
Thank you.
Yes, hello. Katie Dar with the Lake Champlain Basin Program and facilitator of this corner of the room. So really overachievers over there with 3 pages of notes, but I like our ideas as well. So our top priority that we identified was research on private entity salt usage. We discussed, there's obviously still work to do on the municipal level, but even more work to do from the private perspective. And we talked a bit about the different motivations and incentives that private entities have versus municipalities. There's again, that level of service that Matt talked about, and they're not necessarily trying to save money. They're trying to make money and make sure they keep making money with whatever they're offering, keeping a parking lot clear, whatever. So different strategies might be needed to reach that group. We talked about the efficacy of alternatives, not only researching that, but researching how communities might respond to those alternatives related to replacing road salt. And our third priority just got back to the need for basic education about, what road salt is, why it's a problem, that across the board, I think is not something the public is very aware of. So those are our top 3, and I'll leave it there.
Ooh, all right. Hi, everyone. May Kate Campbell, 3rd out of 3 Basin Program staff members and facilitators here today. So we had a management-oriented crowd in this corner. So we talked a little bit about, kind of bridging some of the things that we've learned today with how we can use that new information to take action and what some of those barriers are as well. So a big thing that came up immediately was oftentimes it's difficult at the municipality level to convince the people who are in charge of making decisions, often town select boards, to invest in some of these best management practices for de-icing salt application. So we talked about an education campaign with town select boards being really useful, and across the board in that situation and other situations, just being able to highlight success stories and the cost saving benefits that can come along with de-icing salt best management practice implementation. Because I think I definitely learned a lot about that today. So getting that information out there more broadly would be helpful. We talked about the continuing challenge. It sounds like a lot of people are recognizing of getting state highway departments on board. I'm hearing some chuckles in the room. And just sometimes there's an issue of kind of who is the person who's communicating, like what group is best positioned to communicate both with like town select boards and with the larger state agencies in order to kind of bring that advocacy and kind of motivation for doing this road salt reduction work to the table there. In terms of kind of more researchy ideas, there was some interest in, based on some of the information that was presented today, in getting some more information about how long salt is staying in soil and groundwater once it's applied. And kind of just the general question of like how much salt is stored, like maybe right next to a road on the shoulder or as you get further back. And then also a big question about kind of the state of impacts of salt on private wells. So identifying that as a gap and potentially looking at the age of water in those wells. So you can get a sense for, how long, if a well is contaminated, we would expect that to continue to be an issue. Yeah, and we also thought about with the private wells, that's a great way to connect people with the problem. If they are a home that has a private well and they are facing these impacts of salinization, that might be a way to help convince people about the benefits of de-icing salt application reduction in general. Yeah, and then we also had thoughts about learning more about the magnitude of salt use on private lands and how much of an impact that is having. So I'm going to hand it off to our last group. Thank you.
Thank you. Excuse me, Chris Nowitzki, Lake George Waterkeeper. And, you don't give an advocate the microphone because we'll go with more than 3. But we talked a lot about winter severity index, whether that should be quantified better based on highway department's input and how that can be used to address changing events that we're having now, the rain and snow and ice events. So to better categorize that, so you can compare storms to storms and kind of unify road salt use. We also talked about the chloride legacy effects in groundwater, and think that that's very important. Along with that, the long-term impacts to soils from the cation release discussed today, soil health, release of potassium and others that may even impact the nutrients in our water bodies, release of calcium, invasive species. So we think that's important. Driver's education, talked on earlier, evaluate that, the regulations, there's possibly Quebec has requirements on snow tires. Is that effective? Drivers' expectations and drivers' practices, slowing down, wintertime, such. So, and last, talking about the ecological impacts and to our fisheries, as well as the impacts to the wetlands and riparian zones, how to mitigate that, and how to improve the communications and stories. So.
Thank you very much, Chris and May-Kate and Katie and Dana and Matt. I'm going to do the Zoom ones too, but can you help me? I'm going to take the sheets that you all wrote. Can you just write your name or initials like in the lower right-hand corner? So if I have questions, as we try to translate, we can reach out to the person who was the facilitator of those groups. That would be great. And then in Zoom, I'm going to read them just for simplicity purposes. So thank you, Zoom room team. Emily put in here their top 3: envisioning a world without salt, specific user areas where salt education could be different, for instance, ski areas, and engaging finding private salt applicators who could be one-man operations. And so absolutely true. That is that paper that I talked about private contractors. There's a lot of one-man operations that are out there. So a lot of them are small businesses. So you all are spot on. And then Emily just added in sharing resources across regions. I love it. Very, very great. Emily, can I also contact you as the contact to collect any questions from there? Okay, thanks. She said yes. All right. So I am so appreciative to you all for coming today, for everybody who brought together presentations and shortened them or made them on short notice. And what a rich discussion between the questions that you asked our speakers, the knowledge our speakers shared, and then this time to generate ideas. I'm very excited about where we go from here. And my plan is, again, trying to summarize what you all have put together in terms of ideas, feeding that back out to you, working with the Basin Program or other local funders within Sea Grant to think about what we might prioritize in our next RFP, but also to think about what our next steps might be for outreach or education as well. So I think there's a lot of next steps. I'd love to work with you all on that. And I appreciate the distance that people came, but to be part of this is notable. So thanks for coming from across the lake and from the south and from the north and east and west. Appreciate that. So am I missing anything that I should say to you all before you go and part ways with me here? Yeah, my pleasure. All right, so I will get you all some papers electronically. It looks like I'll get you the recording if you want it as well. And thanks, and hopefully we'll work on next steps together moving forward. So have a good, safe drive. Oh, question. Sure. Are people okay with sharing participant list? Okay. Yes, I can do that. Yep. Sure thing. Okay. Oh, if you would please be willing to do your evaluations before you leave. If you don't, thank you, Jill. If you don't do it, I'm going to email them to you and say, please do it. So if you are willing to do an evaluation, you can leave them on the back table when you go out. It helps us do a better job in the future and to know how you might use the information that you learned today. Super grateful.